Hey, it's good to have you back. Come on in, get yourself wrapped up in something warm, because tonight's story starts on one of the worst nights in the history of Northern Europe, and it ends with a small mystery that took historians centuries to even notice. On a single night in January, in the year 1362, the sea did something the coast of England had never quite prepared for. Stone church towers came crashing down, watermills were ripped apart at the joints, whole villages were simply gone by sunrise, as if they had never been built at all, and yet somewhere along that same stretch of coastline, one small house made of nothing more than bent wood, woven branches and plain mud was still standing when the sun came up. Nobody ever wrote her name down, but her house outlasted buildings raised by kings. Tonight we're going to find out exactly how that happened. Before we step into that night together, do me one small favour first. If slow, cosy history like this happens to be your kind of thing, go ahead and tap subscribe, drop a like. Maybe pass this along to somebody who could use a calm story right about now. And while you are getting settled, tell me in the comments where you're tucking in from tonight and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and it is honestly one of my favourite parts of putting these together. Alright. That is enough from me. Go ahead and dim the lights if you have not already. Turn on a fan or anything with a soft, steady hum, just enough background noise to make this feel real. Get comfortable, close your eyes if that helps, and let's go back. All the way back to a stretch of English coastline on the worst night its people had ever known. Her name, as far as anyone can tell, was lost somewhere in the last 600 years, so let's just call her Agnes. Because somewhere along that coast a woman very much like her was alive and awake on the night this story begins. Agnes lived a short walk from the sea, close enough to smell salt in the air on a bad weather day, in a small village near the mouth of the River Humber, not far from a busy young trading town called Ravensor. Her house was not much to look at, not by our standards. One room, maybe two, walls made from split branches, woven together like a basket, then packed thick with a paste of clay straw, and whatever animal hair happened to be lying around that particular week. A roof of layered straw, thick and steep, sloped just enough to send rain sliding off before it ever thought about seeping in. In the middle of the floor sat a small fire that never really went out, its smoke finding its own slow way up through a gap left open in the thatch. It was not fancy. It was not built to be. It was simply home raised by her husband Watt and a few neighbours, over the course of about 2 weeks using timber from the nearest stand of trees and mud from the nearest ditch. No stone. No cement, because in the year 1362, cement in the way we would recognise it today did not exist anywhere on Earth yet. It would not be invented for close to 500 years. Every home Agnes had ever set foot in, rich or poor, was built the same rough, practical way people had been building for thousands of years, using whatever the land happened to hand them. Most days that little house was a fairly ordinary place. Smoke in your eyes if the wind sat wrong. A goat that had opinions about everything. Children underfoot chasing a chicken that clearly believed it deserved better company. What like to say the whole house smelled like wood smoke and wet wool no matter the season, and he was not wrong, though Agnes would remind him that his boots were doing most of the damage on that front. Her house was one of perhaps 20 scattered along a muddy track that passed for a village, each one built the same rough way, each one leaning on the others without anyone ever quite saying so out loud. Borrow a hen from one neighbour, lend a hand mending a fence to another, trade news and gossip over a shared well. It was not a grand life. Most weeks, it barely gave them enough to get by, but it was a life built on the same quiet, practical knowledge passed down through every family on that track, the kind of knowledge nobody wrote in any book, because everybody simply assumed everybody else already had it. That January had already felt strange before the storm ever arrived. Warmer than usual for the season, then suddenly bitter, the sky doing that thing where it cannot seem to make up its mind. What had noticed the geese leaving early that year, weeks ahead of when they usually bothered. Agnes had noticed the cat would not settle pacing by the door as though she had somewhere better to be. That cat, Watt muttered one evening, only half joking, knows more about the weather than the priest does. Agnes laughed, mostly because it was probably true. Neither of them knew the actual reasons behind any of it, of course. Nobody in that village had a word for what we would later call the Little Ice Age, a stretch of unstable temperamental weather settling over northern Europe that would rattle harvests and coastlines alike for generations. All they knew was that the sky had been behaving oddly, and that oddness was starting to feel less like a passing mood and more like a warning. On the 15th of January, the gale started picking up in a way that felt somehow different. Not the usual winter gusts everyone along that coast had grown used to. This one built steadily hour after hour, as though something out at sea had simply decided not to stop. It also happened by pure bad luck, to fall on a new moon, the kind of night when the tide already climbs higher than usual on its own, with no storm helping it along at all. Add a driving gale straight off the North Sea on top of that, and the water had nowhere sensible left to go but forward onto the land, over dikes that had gone unrepaired for years because half the men who once maintained them had not survived the plague that swept through barely a decade earlier. By late afternoon, the light outside had gone the colour of old iron. By nightfall, Agnes could hear it properly for the first time. Not just the storm pressing against the walls, but something bigger underneath that, a low, constant roar that seemed to rise up out of the ground itself, closer to the sound of a river in flood than anything that belonged in the sky. Watt went out once to check on the animals and came back in soaked clean through, saying almost nothing, which for Watt was somehow more frightening than if he had come back shouting. They pulled the children in close to the fire. Agnes wrapped the youngest in the one good blanket she owned, the one saved for winters exactly like this. Above them, the thatch creaked and strained under the weight of the storm, but it held. The wattle and daub walls flexed just barely, the whole frame of the house seeming to breathe with every gust rather than fight against it outright, the way a ship's hull gives a little in rough water instead of snapping in two. Somewhere out in the dark, other things were not holding at all. Miles down the coast, the young port town of Ravensor-Odd, a place people had been proud enough of to give it its own trading rights and its own church, was being swallowed whole by the sea that night, sand and buildings alike disappearing into the water almost completely in a matter of hours. Across the North Sea, in a wealthy little trading settlement the locals called Rungholt, something very similar was happening, so completely that for the next 600 years some historians would half wonder if the place had ever really existed at all, or if it was only a story people told to explain a stretch of empty mudflat. Later, a monk in Canterbury sat down to describe what that night had been like in whatever plain words a man of his calling could manage. He wrote that the gale had come out of the north and simply refused to stop. Not for a full day, not through the whole night that followed. By the time it finally passed, he said, entire stands of trees were lying flat on the ground. Watermills stood in broken pieces. Houses across the region had folded in on themselves like paper, and church towers, the kind people truly believed would stand for. 1,000 years were lying in the mud right alongside everything else. Historians still argue over the final count of the dead from that single storm, somewhere between 25,000 and, by some grimmer estimates, 100,000 souls spread across England, the Netherlands, northern Germany and Denmark. 44 villages gone in a matter of hours, wiped so thoroughly off the map that some of them were never rebuilt at all. And worth pausing on for just a moment, all of this happened barely a decade after the Black Death had already emptied out half the graveyards of Europe. The same villages that were still short on hands to repair their seawalls and riverbanks were the ones standing directly in the storm's path that night, which is its own quiet, heartbreaking kind of unfair. But in that one small house near the Humber, none of the walls came down. The fire never fully went out. The thatch, battered and soaked through, stayed knitted together above their heads. The bent wooden beams that framed the whole structure, the ones Watt and his neighbours had cut and shaped from young still green oak, groaned and swayed through the worst of it but never once cracked. Agnes would later swear she felt the whole house lean with the gale, then settle back over and over the way a person leans into the wind on a bad day, rather than standing stiff against it and losing their footing. When morning finally came grey and worn thin, Agnes stepped outside into a world that looked like it had been picked up and shaken, fences gone. A neighbour's low stone garden wall flattened flat to the ground. Somebody's cart, upside down in a ditch 2 fields away from where it had started the night before. Word would arrive later that same day about the sea, about ravens are odd, about the sheer scale of what had happened up and down that coast overnight. News that travelled slowly and grimly from village to village over the following days, and her house, her plain humble mud-walled house, was still there, leaning ever so slightly worse for wear, roof a little ragged at one corner but standing. What spent that whole first morning simply walking around it, hand on the wall, saying nothing, the way people do when they are trying to convince themselves something is real. Up and down the track. Doors opened one by one that morning, neighbours stepping out into the wreckage to find each other. Somebody's roof had partly gone. Somebody else's animals had scattered into the fields overnight and would take half the week to round up again. But house after house along that muddy little track, built by the same rough hands using the same mud and the same bent timber, had come through standing, and there was something almost unspoken passing between the villagers that morning, a kind of quiet relief nobody quite had the words for yet. Here is the part almost nobody stops to think about. That night, some of the grandest, most expensive buildings along that coast stone manor halls, church towers, people had paid fortunes to raise up toward heaven, simply came apart. And a house made from branches, dried grass and dirt, the kind of home nobody ever bothered writing about in any official record, rode out that very same storm without breaking. So how does something that sounds so fragile end up outlasting something built from solid stone? It is not luck. Not really. There is an actual reason for it, buried in the very way that house was put together, in choices Watt likely never thought twice about because they were simply how things were done. We're going to come back to this exact house this exact night later on and take it apart piece by piece to understand it properly. But to get there, we first have to understand the world that built it, because nothing about the house was an accident. Every wall, every beam, every choice Watt made while cutting and bending that green oak came out of a way of life shaped by centuries of trial error and hard-earned instinct passed down from one pair of hands to the next. And that story starts a long way from that storm, in the everyday unglamorous world of the people history mostly forgot to name. Now here is where most people get the story wrong, myself included, for a long time. We hear the word peasant, and our minds jump straight to poverty, to people who built with mud and branches simply because they did not know any better, because something sturdier was somehow beyond their understanding. That assumption is not just unfair, it is not even close to true. And once you see why, I think you will start looking at that little house near the Humber a whole lot differently. To understand why Agnes and Watt built the way they did, we need to talk about something that rarely makes it into the exciting version of medieval history, the paperwork. Specifically, a survey ordered by William the Conqueror in the year 1086, one of the strangest and most thorough documents to survive from the entire medieval world. People called it the Domesday Book because, much like the Day of Final Judgment, there was no arguing with it, and no hiding from it. Royal officials rode out across England asking blunt, almost rude questions in every village they passed through. Who holds this land now? Who held it before? How many plough teams? How many free men? How many villains? How many slaves? It was in the most literal sense a full accounting of an entire kingdom, right down to the fish ponds and the pigs. And buried inside that accounting is a detail that quietly explains almost everything about how people like Agnes and Watt lived and built and thought about their own homes. England's rural population, according to that survey, was not one single class of poor farmers. It was a whole ladder of legal categories, each with its own rights, its own obligations, and its own relationship to the land beneath their feet. At the top of that peasant ladder sat the freemen people, who rented land under fairly generous terms and owed their lord little beyond that rent real independence, though not exactly common. Historians estimate freemen made up only around 1/10 of the rural population in parts of England at the time. Below them came the villeins, the largest single group holding a reasonable amount of land, often 10 to 20 acres, but bound to their lord by unpaid labour, expected to spend certain days each week working his fields before they were ever allowed to tend their own. Below the villeins came the cotters and boarders, families squeezed onto a garden's worth of land, sometimes less, just enough to keep a family from starving nowhere near enough to live on alone. And at the very bottom, a smaller number who were in the plainest possible terms enslaved outright, owning nothing, including in the eyes of the law their own labour. All of this sat inside a larger arrangement historians call the manor, and it is worth slowing down on for a moment because the word gets thrown around a lot without much explanation. A manor was not simply a fancy house. It was an entire working estate split roughly into two kinds of land. One portion, called the domain, belonged directly to the lord and was farmed purely for his benefit. The rest was parcelled out among the villeins, cotters, and boarders. We just talked about land they could work for their own families, but only after the domain fields had been tended first, and only for as long as the lord allowed it. Every village Agnes ever knew operated somewhere inside that basic shape, a patchwork of land nobody at the bottom truly controlled, held together by custom obligation, and whichever lord happened to hold the deed that particular decade. Here is the detail that matters for our story tonight. Almost none of these people at any rung of that ladder actually owned the ground their house stood on. Even a fairly comfortable villain was at the end of the day working land that legally belonged to somebody else, a lord who could and sometimes did reassign it. Now stop and ask yourself an honest question. If you did not fully own the plot beneath your feet, if the arrangement could shift with a new lord, a bad harvest, or simply a change of luck, would you pour your life savings into a stone house built to outlast your grandchildren? Or would you build something fast, cheap, and good enough, using materials that cost you almost nothing but your own two hands and a favour or two from your neighbours? That right there is the real engineering behind the mud-walled house, not ignorance, strategy. Now let's put a number on the alternative because I think it makes the whole picture land a little harder. Around a century and a half after the storm we just talked about, an English king named Edward I decided he wanted a ring of castles built across North Wales to make absolutely certain the region stayed under his control. One of those castles, Caernarfon, ended up costing somewhere in the neighbourhood of £25,000 by the time the accounts finally stopped, a figure historians today place at somewhere around £17.5 million in modern money. At the busiest point of construction, the project employed roughly 400 stonemasons, 200 quarrymen, 30 blacksmiths and thousands more labourers hauling material, all working under a master mason, paid handsomely just to manage the operation. Walls 20 feet thick in places, towers designed to intimidate an entire population just by existing. That is what money, permission and royal authority could buy in the medieval world. A fortress built to last centuries, employing a small army of skilled specialists funded by a king, willing to borrow heavily from foreign bankers to pay for it. Meanwhile, a family like Agnes and Watts built an entire home for the cost of some borrowed time from their neighbours, and whatever the nearest ditch and woodland happened to offer for free. Two completely different economies existing at the exact same moment in history on the exact same island. And here is the part I find almost more interesting than the castle itself. It is not that peasants had never heard of anything stronger than mud, lime mortar, the genuine ancient binding agent, the stuff that held together everything from Roman temples to the great cathedrals rising across medieval Europe, had already been in use for thousands of years by the time Agnes was alive. Her own local church may well have been built with it. She almost certainly knew it existed. What she did not have was access to a limestone quarry, a kiln hot enough to burn it properly, the fuel to keep that kiln running for days at a time, or the money to pay skilled masons to mix and apply it correctly. Lime mortar was not some undiscovered secret waiting for a peasant genius to stumble upon it. It was a resource locked behind cost, behind permission, behind an entire supply chain that simply did not extend down to people at the bottom of that doomsday ladder, so they built with what was actually available to them. And it turns out, as we're going to keep seeing throughout tonight's story, what was available to them was a great deal smarter than we tend to give it credit for. Take the wood itself for a moment, because this one honestly surprised me the first time I read about it. You might picture medieval peasants simply wandering into a forest and hacking down whatever tree happened to be standing there, taking what they needed with no thought for what came next. The reality was almost the opposite. Across large parts of medieval England and much of continental Europe as well, local woodlands were managed on a careful repeating cycle, a technique historians now call coppicing. Certain trees, hazel especially, were cut back close to the ground, on a rotation lasting anywhere from 5 to 20 years, which sounds almost like cutting the tree down entirely, except that many species respond to this by sending up a whole cluster of straight new shoots from the same living root system. Cut one section of woodland this year, another section next year, and by the time you circle back around to that first patch, it has regrown into exactly the kind of long, flexible, easy-to-bend timber that wattlework depends on. And it goes even further than that, because the more foresters and historians study old woodland records, the more it looks like villagers were not just cutting hazel on rotation. They were running something closer to a two-tier system. Down low, the coppiced hazel and willow harvested again and again on that short cycle for wattle, for fencing, for kindling. Scattered among them, standing taller, a smaller number of oak trees left almost entirely alone sometimes for 30 years or more, growing slow and straight, reserved, specifically for the heavy structural beams a house frame actually needed. Foresters today call it coppice, with standards and tree ring studies on surviving medieval oak beams still show the clear fingerprint of that management pattern. Sudden bursts of faster growth every few decades, right when the surrounding coppice would have been cut back and the crowded competition for sunlight briefly cleared away. In other words, someone, generations before Agnes was ever born, looked at a patch of forest and thought several decades into the future, planning a supply of building timber for grandchildren they would never meet. Do you see what I'm getting at here? This was not a community fumbling around with primitive tools because nothing better existed yet. This was a system refined over centuries past from one generation to the next, without a single textbook, without a university, without anybody ever writing the rules down in one tidy place. And it worked well enough that some of those same coppice management patterns are still visible in old woodlands today, showing up in tree ring studies that stretch back hundreds of years. If someone described that same practice to you today, planning a renewable material supply decades in advance, tuned carefully to what the land could sustainably give back, you would probably call it good environmental design. Back then, nobody needed a fancy word for it. It was simply how you kept your family and every family after yours from running out of the one resource an entire village depended on. Of course, none of this came free of cost to Agnes and Watt, not in the way we usually mean that word. The price was paid in something else entirely: time. Depending on exactly where they lived and who their lord happened to be, families like theirs likely owed a set number of days each week, working the lord's own fields before they were ever free to tend their own crops, let alone repair a roof or rebuild a wall. Historians sometimes call these obligatory days boon work, a term that always makes me smile a little, because there was nothing especially boon about it from the peasant's side of the arrangement. It meant that building or repairing a house had to happen in whatever narrow gaps of free time remained: evenings, feast days, the depth of winter when the fields demanded less. Which is exactly why building a house was almost never a solo project. It was closer to what we might picture as an old-fashioned barn-raising neighbour. Helping neighbour, because everybody understood without needing to be told that next season it would be their own roof needing hands. A father would teach his son how to read the bend in a length of green oak, how much daub mixture a wall section actually needed before it started sagging under its own weight, which patch of coppiced hazel was ready to cut, and which needed another year or two to mature. None of it was written down in any surviving manual because none of it needed to be. It lived in muscle memory and stories, told while working in a boy standing beside his father with mud up past his elbows, learning a trade that would keep his own family dry for the next 40 years. Picture for a moment a boy we will call Hob watching his father work a fresh patch of daub between his palms one spring morning, testing it for exactly the right stickiness before it went up onto the wattle. Too wet and it would slide right off the branches, too dry and it would crack apart with the first hard frost. There was no written rule for how it was supposed to feel, no measurement, no scale. His father simply knew rolling a small handful between finger and thumb, judging it the same quiet way a baker judges dough or a shepherd judges the weight of a cloud. He passed a lump to Hob without a word and waited, watching the boy's face as he tried to guess what his father already understood in his hands. It took Hob years to get it right. More failed patches than anyone ever bothered, counting walls that sagged and had to be redone, mixtures that dried too fast in the summer heat and crumbled before the season was even out. Nobody scolded him for it particularly hard. This was simply how the trade passed down through mistakes made early and corrected young long before a boy's own family depended on the roof holding. By the time Hob was old enough to marry and build a place of his own, that knowledge lived somewhere past memory in his hands themselves the same way his own fathers had. That kind of knowledge does not show up in any royal survey. It never got a mention in the accounts kept for Sonarfon Castle either. But it built far more homes across medieval Europe than any king's fortress ever did, and it did so with almost none of the fanfare. So when we talk about medieval peasants building without cement, I do not think the most interesting part of that sentence is the word cement at all. I think it is everything sitting quietly behind it, an entire economy of land. You did not own labour. You owed to somebody else timber grown on purpose rather than found by accident, and knowledge that travelled from hand to hand instead of page to page. None of that was an accident. None of it happened because nobody knew any better. It happened because generation after generation, ordinary people quietly built the most functional system available to them, out of the only things nobody could take away: their patience, their neighbours, and their own two hands. Which brings us to a question that Agnes and Watt and every family like them had to answer before a single branch was ever cut or a single wall raised. With all of that in mind, land you could not fully claim as your own materials, you had to grow and manage years ahead of time, and only scattered evenings to actually build with. Where exactly do you even decide to put a house in the first place? Because as it turns out, the ground itself had already killed off more medieval homes than any storm ever managed on its own, and that is exactly where we are headed next. So let's actually sit with that question for a moment, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. Before a single branch was cut or a single wall raised, somebody had to decide quite literally where on this earth a family was going to spend the rest of their lives. And in the medieval world, that decision was never as simple as walking out one morning and picking a spot that looked pleasant. For most families, the choice barely felt like a choice at all. If you were born into a village, you likely inherited a plot inside it, a patch known as a toft. The little parcel where the house and its outbuildings sat backed by a longer strip called a croft, used for a garden, a pig, maybe a few rows of beans and onions. Toft and croft together usually ran to something like a quarter acre, up to a full acre fenced off from the neighbours, with a low bank and ditch, just enough to keep a wandering goat from making a decision about your vegetables that was not yours to make. You did not really choose that plot. Your father worked it before you, and quite often his father before him passed down the way a name or a debt gets passed down without much ceremony, and without much choice in the matter either. The house might be rebuilt 3 or 4 times across 100 years, each new frame going up more or less where the old one had stood because that patch of ground was, in every sense that mattered, already spoken for, already carrying the weight of everyone who had lived and died on it before you arrived. But villages did grow, especially in the centuries before famine and plague thinned the population back down. And when a family needed new ground entirely, the process looked very different, and honestly a lot more bureaucratic than you might expect from people we tend to picture as living close to total freedom in the open countryside. If the land you wanted sat inside what English law called a royal forest, and that legal definition covered a great deal more than actual dense woodland covering heath and pasture, and even existing farmland in places you were not simply allowed to clear it and start building. Clearing forest land for a new plot was called a sarting, and doing it without permission counted as one of the most serious offences you could commit, under forest law worse in the eyes of that law than simply cutting a few trees for firewood. Get caught, and you would find yourself standing in front of the Lord's Forest Court explaining yourself. Most of the time you were not thrown off the land. You were fined instead, then made to pay an annual rent for the very ground you had just cleared with your own hands and back. It was in its own strange medieval way, a system for turning trespass into income, and everybody involved seemed to understand the arrangement well enough to keep repeating it for centuries. We actually have some real numbers on this, and I think they are worth sitting with for a second because they tell you something about scale. In the old Forest of Arden, in what is now Warwickshire, records from the 12 and 1300s show grants of assarted land running anywhere from 2 or 3 acres for an ordinary family, up to 60 acres for the wealthiest local lords clearing ground on a much grander scale. One patch near Lapworth saw 90 acres cleared and brought into cultivation by the year 1276 alone. Whole new hamlets grew directly out of this process, scattered farmsteads with names that still exist on maps. Today, communities that did not exist a century earlier, carved quite literally out of standing forest tree by tree root by stubborn root. Here is a detail I love, and I promise it connects directly back to this idea of choosing where to live. Think about English surnames for a second, the ordinary unremarkable ones you've heard 1,000 times without ever really asking where they came from. Atwell, Underhill, Bywater, Overbrook, Greenwood. These are not random collections of syllables somebody invented for flavour. They come directly from this exact process families identified quite literally by the specific spot on the landscape their household occupied. The family living at the well became over a generation or two the Atwells. The household tucked beneath the rise of a hill became the Underhills. Somewhere, presumably, a family that built a little too close to a particularly unpleasant bog earned a name we simply do not use anymore. And honestly, maybe that is for the best. It is a small thing, but I find it kind of remarkable that hundreds of years later, you might be sitting there right now with a surname that is, whether you know it or not, a fossilized address, a description of exactly where one of your ancestors decided the land was good enough to settle. So what actually made a spot good enough? This is where it gets properly interesting, because choosing a homestead site was its own quiet discipline, built entirely on observation, rather than instruments passed down the same way the daub mixing and the timber selection were through watching and doing rather than reading. Water came first, always. Not river water, ideally, which could flood, freeze solid, or simply wander somewhere else after a bad season of rain, but a spring or a reliable well close enough that carrying it home did not eat up half a morning, yet high enough above the surrounding ground that the water table would not simply rise up into your floor the first wet winter. This sounds like common sense until you remember that entire settlements across history have failed to get this balance right, choosing convenience over elevation and paying for it every single spring when the thaw came through. The families who lasted, who were still living in the same spot 200 years later, tended to be the ones who had quietly gotten this one decision correct at the very start, often without ever writing down why, and that decision was rarely made in a single afternoon. Anyone with half a lifetime of experience on the land knew better than to judge a plot on a fair autumn day alone. A field that looked perfectly dry and pleasant in September could turn into standing marsh by February, once the frost let go and every bit of rain the winter had been holding back finally worked its way down through the soil at once. The patient way to choose ground the way that actually got passed from parent to child was to watch it properly through a full turn of the seasons, if you had the luxury of waiting that long, noting where the frost lingered longest in the mornings, where puddles gathered and refused to drain, where the first green shoots of spring pushed through soonest, since early growth was often a quiet signal that the soil underneath drained well and warmed quickly. It was not science, not in the way we would use that word today, but it worked closely enough to science that the results still hold up when modern surveyors walk the same ground centuries later. Then came the slope itself, and this is where I think the thinking gets almost elegant. A gentle rise facing roughly toward the sun's path drained naturally after rain, instead of holding water in a stagnant pool against the base of your walls, which, if you remember what we talked about a little earlier, spelled real trouble for a structure built from clay and woven branches. That same gentle slope also caught more direct sunlight through the day, which meant a warmer house in the winter, and drier ground underfoot. A small difference that multiplied across 40 winters of a person's life was not small at all. And here is a question worth turning over in your own mind for a second. If you were choosing a spot for your own home today, with no modern drainage, no pump, no insulation to fall back on, do you think you would have noticed all of that on your own, just by walking the land and paying attention? Wind mattered too, though in a slightly less romantic way than water and sunlight. A family did not just think about which direction felt pleasant to stand in. They thought about which direction carried smells away from the house, rather than through it. The privy, the animal pens, anything that produced waste went downhill and downwind whenever the land allowed for it, keeping the worst of it moving away from the well and away from the door. It is not a detail that ends up in paintings or poems about the idyllic English countryside, but it shaped where houses actually sat just as much as sunlight and water did, maybe more. Get that particular arrangement wrong, put your well downhill from where the animals were kept, for instance, and you would not necessarily notice the mistake right away. It might take a wet season or two before anyone connected a run of sickness in the household to a decision made years earlier about which corner of the toff to dig the well in. That kind of consequence, slow, quiet, and easy to miss at the time, is exactly the sort of thing that turned careful observation into a survival skill rather than a nicety. And then finally, the ground itself, the dirt under your boots. Good building clay, the kind that held together properly for daub, was not spread evenly across the countryside. Some patches of land gave up clay that cracked the moment it dried. others held together beautifully. Families who had lived somewhere for generations knew exactly which field, which ditch bank, which patch behind the old oak produced daub that would hold through a hard winter, and which one would leave you patching cracks every spring for the rest of your life. That knowledge alone could be the difference between a house that stood for 80 years and one that had to be half rebuilt every decade. Not every village got all of this right, and it is worth being honest about that rather than pretending medieval people had some kind of flawless mystical connection to the land that we have since lost. In Lincolnshire, in the north of England, there is a place called Gainsthorpe, and if you walked across that field today you would see almost nothing at first glance, just gentle grassy humps and hollows rolling across an otherwise empty pasture, the kind of field you might drive straight past without a second look. Look closer though, and the shapes resolve into something unmistakable. The outlines of house plots, a scatter of tofts and crofts, even the clear rectangular hollow of what was once a fish pond, and traces of what may have been a dovecote. An entire working village simply gone folded back into the grass as quietly as it must once have risen out of it. Historians still are not entirely certain why. Some point to poor drainage on that particular stretch of ground. Others suspect the usual slow economic pressures that emptied out so many small villages in the centuries following the Black Death. Local legend, for what it is worth, insists the place was torn down because it had become a den of thieves, which makes for a wonderful story around a fire but has never actually been proven by a single piece of archaeological evidence. What we do know with certainty is that people once stood in that empty field and made exactly the same calculations Agnes and Watt had made judge the water, the slope, the clay, built their lives there, and for reasons now half lost to us it did not last. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment. Even good judgment does not guarantee permanence. Sometimes the land shifts under you. Sometimes the economy does. Sometimes a village simply runs out of the particular circumstances that made it viable in the first place, no matter how carefully that first family read the ground centuries earlier. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth mentioning before we move on, because it surprised me when I first came across it. A fair number of English villages were not organic at all, not the accidental result of families settling wherever felt right over generations. Walk through parts of Yorkshire today, and you can still trace villages laid out with almost startling precision rows of tofts and crofts, running in straight, evenly measured lines, facing a single street or a long village green clearly planned in advance rather than grown haphazardly. Historians studying old maps and surviving earthworks have found these regular ruler-straight layouts again and again, evidence that a fair number of lords, especially after the upheaval of the Norman conquest, sat down and essentially designed new villages from scratch, allotting standard-sized plots to tenants the way you might lay out lots in a new housing development today. It is a strange thought that some of the cosiest, most organic-looking English villages in old paintings were in their earliest form about as deliberately planned as a modern subdivision, just with mud instead of asphalt and oxen instead of surveying equipment. The lord got tidy, taxable, easily managed rows of tenants. The tenants got a plot with reasonably fair access to the shared fields beyond it. Nobody involved would have called it town planning, but that is more or less exactly what it was. So by the time whatever cut his first length of oak, the location of that little house near the Humber had already passed through generations of quiet, careful decision-making. Water slope wind clay custom, and probably a fair bit of argument nobody bothered writing down. None of it guaranteed the house would survive what came later, but it meant the ground beneath it was not chosen carelessly, and as we are about to see, that groundwork mattered just as much as anything Watt did with his own two hands once the building itself finally began, Because once the site was settled, the real test started, the part where all of that careful thinking about water and slope and clay had to become an actual standing structure strong enough to hold its own weight through decades of English weather, and that meant starting with the one part of the house that everything else, the walls, the roof, the whole family's safety through 40 winters, would eventually depend on completely a skeleton of bent living wood that somehow needed to hold everything together without a single nail ever entering the frame. Alright, so let's actually get our hands into it now, because this is the part of the story I have been looking forward to telling you the most. Everything up to this point, the water, the slope, the clay, the whole quiet science of choosing where to live, none of it matters if the thing standing on top of that ground cannot hold itself up. So let's talk about bones, wooden ones. If you had walked across medieval England with an eye for buildings, you would have noticed fairly quickly that there was not just one way to frame a house. Two main approaches dominated, and which one you saw depended almost entirely on where you happened to be standing. In the west and the north, in places like the County Agnes and Watt called home builders, favoured something called a cruck frame, a design built around massive curved timbers, usually a matched pair cut from the same tree, split straight down the middle so the two halves mirrored one another almost perfectly. Each timber ran from the ground up in a long graceful bend, meeting its partner at the very top to form a shape somewhere between the letter A and a longbow standing on end. Down in the south and east, carpenters more often built what we now call a box frame, a rectangular skeleton of straight upright posts and horizontal beams, closer to what you would picture if I simply said the words timber frame house, without any other context. Both approaches worked. Both could stand for centuries, but they came from completely different relationships with the material itself, and I think that difference tells you something quietly important about how these builders actually thought. A box frame is in a sense an argument for control. You take relatively straight timber and you force it into a tidy right-angled grid correcting nature's crookedness, with the saw and the axe until the wood behaves the way you want it to. A cruck frame is closer to a negotiation. You go looking for a tree that has already grown with roughly the right curve in it, one that spent decades leaning toward the light in exactly the shape you happen to need, and instead of fighting that shape, you use it. You're not imposing a form onto the material. You're finding the form the material was already halfway toward becoming, and finishing the conversation, the tree started on its own one slow ring of growth at a time. I think about that distinction more than I probably should, honestly. Two completely different philosophies of building, developing side by side in the same country, sometimes in villages barely a day's walk apart and neither one considered wrong. Nobody in the west of England was writing letters to the southeast insisting that box frames were the only proper way to build a house. Both traditions simply worked refined by whichever generation happened to be standing in that particular landscape with that particular kind of timber growing nearby. It is a small reminder that there was rarely only one correct answer to any of these medieval building questions, only answers that fit the land, the trees and the hands available to shape them. Finding those trees was its own quiet skill, one that probably took a lifetime to get properly good at. Not every curved trunk was usable. Too sharp a bend and the timber would be structurally weak exactly where you needed it strongest. Too gentle, and it would not clear the roofline the way the design required. An experienced carpenter walking through coppiced woodland, the same carefully managed woodland we talked about a little earlier, would have an eye trained to spot the right shape almost instinctively, the way you or I might spot a particular face in a crowded room without quite being able to explain how we did it. He was not just looking for one good tree either. Cruck construction generally called for the two curved timbers on each pair to be split from the very same trunk, so their bends would mirror one another exactly once raised, and set facing each other at the peak. That meant a carpenter was not simply hunting for any tree with a pleasing curve. He needed one large enough and straight-grained enough to be split clean down its length, without the whole thing splintering apart under the axe, a single tree effectively becoming the match skeleton for one entire end of a house. Once the right timbers were found and felled, the truly clever part of the process began, and this is the piece I think most people never hear about because it rarely makes it into the tidy version of medieval history. A carpenter did not simply haul rough timbers to the building site and start hammering them together. He laid the entire frame out flat first, often right there on the ground, beside the plot, sometimes on a smooth patch of earth that essentially served as a giant drafting table. Every joint was cut, tested, adjusted, and fitted by hand, one timber against the next, long before anything was actually raised upright. And because no two hand-hewn timbers were ever perfectly identical, each joint was in a real sense custom-made, fitted specifically to its one partner and no other. That created an obvious problem. If every joint was unique, how did anyone remember which beam married? Which, especially once dozens of timbers were lying scattered across the ground, waiting to be assembled properly on the actual day of construction? The answer was a system of small carved notches and scored lines, cut directly into the wood at each joint, a kind of private code shared between the carpenter and his own memory, and often between master and apprentice as well. Matching marks meant matching pieces. It is, when you think about it, not so different from the little printed symbols you find stamped into flat-pack furniture today, except this version was carved by hand into solid oak, meant to survive not a weekend of assembly but several hundred years of English weather. Now the joint itself, the actual connection holding two pieces of timber together, this is where the real engineering lived. The standard solution used again and again across the entire medieval world was something carpenters called a mortise and tenon. One timber was carved to end in a tongue, a tenon shaped and smoothed to a precise thickness. The timber meeting it was carved with a matching pocket, a mortise cut just deep and wide enough to receive that tongue exactly. Slide the tenon into the mortise and the two pieces of wood locked together not through glue, not through any adhesive at all, but through pure, patient shaping wood, bearing directly against wood, the load of the entire structure passing cleanly from one timber into the next. Sometimes, of course, a single tree simply did not grow long enough to span the full length a wall or a roof beam actually needed. Rather than give up and settle for a shorter house, carpenters worked out a separate solution for that problem too, a joint called a scarf, which let two shorter timbers overlap along their length, in a carefully shaped interlocking cut, then pegged tight in exactly the same manner as everything else. So the finished beam behaved as one continuous piece of wood, rather than two pieces awkwardly butted together. It is a small thing easy to walk straight past if you did not know to look for it, but it tells you something about the mindset behind all of this. The length of the nearest tree was never treated as a hard limit on what the house was allowed to be. It was simply one more constraint to be solved the same patient way every other constraint on that toft had already been solved, and then to keep that joint from working itself loose over years of wind and settling carpenters drove a wooden peg straight through both pieces at once, through the tenon and through the surrounding mortise, together locking the whole assembly in place. These pegs had their own lovely little name, by the way. Carpenters sometimes called them tree nails, which over time got worn down in everyday speech into a single word, and I have always found something quietly charming about that phrase, a nail made entirely from a tree instead of a forge, doing precisely the job an iron nail does without ever once touching a fire. Here is the detail that properly impressed me the first time I understood how it worked, and I promise this is worth slowing down for. The hole for that wooden peg was not drilled straight through in one clean matching line. Carpenters deliberately bored the hole through the mortise piece slightly offset from where they bored it through the tenon, just a hair off centre, sometimes barely the width of a fingernail. When you then forced a slightly tapered peg through both misaligned holes, at once the peg had to bend ever so slightly to make it through, and in doing that it pulled the two timbers hard against one another, clamping the joint tighter than either piece could ever have managed sitting there on its own. Carpenters called this trick draw boring, and it meant a house frame was not just held together the day it went up. It was actively permanently pulling itself tighter a little more with every passing season, as the green oak dried out and the whole structure settled into its final, most stable shape. Does it not seem almost unfair in the nicest possible way that a piece of technology this elegant came from people we still sometimes picture as fumbling around in the mud with no idea what they were doing? At the peak of a cruck frame where those two great curved timbers finally met overhead, carpenters had to solve one more small puzzle, and it turns out they solved it in more ways than you might expect. Historians who have spent careers studying surviving cruck buildings, some of them still standing since the 1200s, have documented close to 20 distinctly different ways. Medieval carpenters chose to join those two blades together at the top, some locked with a mortise and tenon of their own, some simply lapped over one another and pinned through with a single heavy peg, some braced with an extra crosspiece called a collar or a saddle to spread the load more evenly across both timbers. There was no single official rule book. There was regional habit, personal preference, the particular curve of the two timbers a carpenter happened to be working with that season, and centuries of small, quiet trial and error, passed down exactly the way we talked about with the daub mixture a little earlier, hand to hand, not page to page. Once every joint was cut, tested, marked and ready, came the day itself, the raising, and I do think this deserves to be pictured properly rather than rushed past. A finished wall section, several timbers already pegged together into one long unit, lying flat on the ground, could weigh an enormous amount, far more than one family could ever lift alone. So they did not lift it alone. Neighbours arrived with long wooden poles, sometimes called pike poles, positioned along the base of the frame, and on a shared count, the whole assembled wall was walked upright together, poles pushing from below, while ropes steadied it from the sides until it stood vertical and could be braced temporarily in place, while the next section went up beside it. There would have been shouting that day, I imagine, plenty of it, half of it useful instruction, and half of it the kind of good-natured heckling that shows up whenever a group of people attempt something physically difficult together in public. Someone's rope would slip. Someone would misjudge the timing of the count and end up leaning the wrong direction at exactly the wrong moment. Children would have been underfoot the entire time, alternately helping and getting firmly repeatedly told to stand back. It is in more or less every meaningful sense the exact same tradition that later crossed the ocean and became the American barn-raising neighbours gathering for a single explosive burst of shared, dangerous, celebratory labour, followed more often than not by a shared meal, and probably more ale than was strictly wise given what everyone has just been lifting over their heads. None of this happened with the tools you might picture if I said the word carpenter today. There were no saws doing most of the heavy shaping, not the way we would think of them now. Timber was rough-shaped first with an axe swung with a level of accuracy that honestly borders on athletic, then refined further with an adze, a curved blade mounted at a right angle to its handle, swung downward toward the carpenter's own feet, in a motion that looks to modern eyes close to reckless, yet produced remarkably flat, even surfaces in skilled hands. Holes for the mortises and for those clever offset pegs were bored out using hand augers twisted slowly and steadily through solid oak. And for the final smoothing wooden planes did the work a shaped wooden body holding an angled iron blade in place with nothing more than a tight wooden wedge adjusted by feel and by eye rather than by any measurement we would recognize today. I think it is worth pausing on just how much trust that required. No calipers to double-check a measurement, no level to confirm a beam sat perfectly true. A carpenter's entire sense of accuracy lived in his own eye, his own hands, and whatever he had learned standing beside someone older who had learned it the exact same way. Get it wrong on a cathedral and a wealthy patron might simply pay to have the mistake quietly corrected. Get it wrong on a peasant's cruck frame and there was no quiet correction waiting in the wings, only a family who would be living, sleeping and raising children directly underneath whatever that carpenter's hands had produced. So when Watt and his neighbours finally stood back and looked at a bare standing frame, no walls yet no roof, just bent oak reaching up against the sky, what they were actually looking at was hundreds of individually fitted, individually marked, hand-tightened joints, holding together an entire structure without a single piece of metal anywhere inside it. It is, I think, one of the most quietly impressive things human beings have ever figured out how to do, with nothing but wood patience and a fairly serious amount of trust in their own two hands. And that bare frame on its own was still just a skeleton open to every gust of wind and every drop of rain that wanted to pass straight through it. The real transformation, the moment that skeleton actually became a home, capable of keeping a family warm and dry through a night like the one we started with, was still to come, and it began with something far more humble than oak. It began with mud. Mud. I know how that word sounds, especially after everything we just spent talking through with the timber, all that precision, all those carefully drawboard joints pulling themselves tighter, year after year. Mud feels like a step backward, almost a punchline, and yet this is the part of the house that decided more than almost anything else whether a family stayed warm through a cruel winter or spent the whole season shivering behind walls that let every draft straight through. So let's give mud the respect it actually earned. Once that bare oak skeleton stood upright, braced and pegged into place, it was still in the most literal sense just a frame open to the weather on every side. The gaps between each upright timber needed filling, and filling them properly involved two completely separate skills working together, the weaving and the daubing, each one deceptively simple to describe and honestly difficult to do well. The weaving came first. Thin, flexible rods, usually coppiced hazel or willow. The very same managed woodland we talked about earlier were split and threaded horizontally between a row of upright stakes set into the timber frame or driven directly into a groove cut along the sill beam. Builders actually had two different words for these two different roles, which I think is a nice small window into how seriously they took the craft. The upright pieces held rigid were called the staves. The flexible rods woven back and forth between them were called withies. Stave and withy structure and flexibility working against one another, the exact same way warp and weft work against each other on a loom, which now that I say it out loud is probably not a coincidence at all. Basket weaving and wall building grew up as close cousins in most traditional societies, and it shows. The weaving itself took real judgment, not just patience. Pack the withies too tightly together, and you would burn through good coppice material far faster than necessary for a wall that, if anything, held on to less daub than a slightly looser weave would have. Space them too far apart, and the daub had nothing proper to grip, nothing to lock its fingers around, and would simply slump off the wall in wet weather before it ever had the chance to dry and harden. The right spacing sat somewhere in between, tight enough to hold real structure, loose enough to leave gaps, generous enough for the daub to squeeze through and grab hold on both sides at once, essentially stitching itself through the wattle, rather than merely resting against it. It is worth pointing out too that this whole weaving stage produced its own small satisfying rhythm once someone got properly good at it over-under the withy bending and complaining slightly with every pass, then settling flat once it found its place among the staves. Watch someone experienced do it, and it looks almost meditative, closer to knitting than to construction. Watch a beginner attempt the same thing, and you get snapped withy's uneven gaps and a fair amount of muttering under the breath. I imagine more than a few children learned this particular skill first, precisely because a broken withy cost the household almost nothing, while a broken oak beam most certainly did not. And that brings us to the daub itself, the actual mixture, which I think deserves a slightly closer look than most retellings give it, because dismissing it as simply mud sells the whole thing badly short. A working daub mixture generally combined 4 separate ingredients, and each one was doing a distinct, deliberate job, whether or not anyone mixing it that morning could have explained the chemistry in those terms. Clay formed the base, the sticky binder, holding everything else together, but clay on its own has an obvious weakness. As it dries, it shrinks, and shrinking unevenly means cracking sometimes badly enough to open real gaps straight through to the outside air. So builders cut that clay with sand or a coarser subsoil and aggregate that reduced the overall shrinkage and kept the mixture from pulling apart on itself as it cured. Then came straw chopped and worked evenly through the mix, functioning almost exactly the way steel reinforcement bars function inside modern concrete, a fine mesh of fibre running in every direction through the clay, holding tension across any hairline crack that tried to start, stopping it before it could spread into something that actually let weather through, and finally animal hair, sometimes cattle hair, sometimes goat worked in for the very same reinforcing reason, on a smaller, finer scale, filling in the tiny gaps the coarser straw fibres could not quite reach. Put that combination together, properly worked and reworked by hand until it reached the right sticky, slightly stringy consistency, and you end up with a material that truly does behave in the plainest engineering sense, like reinforced concrete, built entirely from things you could find within a short walk of your own front door. No factory, no kiln beyond the one already burning in the middle of the room for cooking. Just clay, sand, straw, hair, and an enormous amount of accumulated unwritten knowledge about exactly how wet the mixture needed to be before it stopped sliding off the wattle and started instead holding itself firmly in place. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. If you had never seen concrete, never heard the word reinforcement, would you have thought to combine 4 completely different materials, this precisely purely from watching what happened when you got the ratio wrong a few too many times? Because that is essentially how this recipe came together, not through any laboratory, but through generations of walls that cracked walls that held, and families who paid close enough attention to remember exactly why. We actually have some wonderful physical proof of this recipe surviving, rather than just written description or guesswork, and it comes from that same deserted settlement in the Yorkshire Wolds we touched on briefly earlier, Warren Percy. When archaeologists carefully excavated the remains of its peasant houses, they found the daub itself still clinging in places to fragments of the original wattle, and the composition told its own quiet, precise story, a mixture built specifically from lime and animal hair bound through the woven branches. That detail matters more than it might sound like at first. It tells us these were not families simply grabbing whatever mud happened to be nearest and hoping for the best. Somebody in that particular village generations before any of this was ever written down for us to find, understood that lime worked into the mixture even in small quantities, made the daub more resistant to the damp that otherwise crept steadily into everything built that low to the English ground. And notice, if you will, what that finding actually tells us about the wider economy we spent so long unpacking earlier. These were not families with any access to the sort of quarried kiln-fired lime mortar that went into a castle wall. What they almost certainly had was a small amount of lime likely burned locally in a modest kiln shared across the village, or gathered through whatever limited trade reached that stretch of Yorkshire, used sparingly mixed carefully into a material that otherwise cost them nothing but time. It is a small, quiet example of exactly the same pattern we keep running into throughout this whole story. Take whatever fragment of the expensive world happens to be within reach, and stretch it as far as patience and skill will allow. Applying the mixture once it was properly worked was its own particular skill, and honestly a fairly physical one. Handfuls were pressed directly into the wattle from both sides at once, wherever there were enough hands available to manage it, worked deep into every gap between the withies so the material actually locked mechanically around the wood, rather than simply sitting flat against its surface like a coat of paint. It needed to go on in reasonably thin layers too, patience being the operative word here because a layer applied too thick all at once dried unevenly, slumping under its own weight before the outer surface had firmed up enough to hold it, and cracking badly once it finally did dry. Get that part wrong, and you'd be back out there within a season repatching a wall that should have lasted for years. And here is a detail I happen to like quite a lot because unlike hauling and shaping that oak frame which called for genuine upper body strength, and a fair amount of physical risk-daubing was work almost anyone in the household could take part in, which meant it was often one of the few building tasks where an entire family, parents, grandparents, children old enough to be trusted not to eat the straw, worked literally elbow to elbow on the very same wall at the very same time. If you've ever wondered where the everyday phrase about getting your hands dirty actually earned its meaning in the first place, you're looking quite literally straight at it. Picture that scene for a second rather than rushing past it, because I think it is one of the warmer images buried inside this whole story. A whole family gathered around a mixing pit dug straight into the ground, treading the clay and straw, together with bare feet to work it evenly, the way you might picture grapes being pressed for wine, laughing, probably arguing occasionally about whether the mixture had reached the right consistency, yet mud passed the ankles and up the forearms of everyone involved. It was not glamorous work. It was slow, repetitive, and thoroughly exhausting by the end of a long day. But it was also in its own quiet way one of the few moments in a hard, heavily divided medieval life where the whole household, regardless of age or strength, was doing precisely the same job, shoulder to shoulder, building the very walls they would all sleep behind that winter. Once the daub had cured properly, which could take anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks. Depending on the weather, many households finished the surface with a thin coat of lime wash, a simple mixture of burnt lime and water brushed on almost like a coat of paint. This was not the same thing as the expensive structural lime mortar we talked about earlier, the kind reserved for castle walls and cathedral stonework. A lime wash coating used only a fraction of the lime spread thin across a surface that was already doing the real structural work on its own. It gave the wall a pale, weatherproof skin helped shed rain before it ever reached the daub underneath. And as something of a happy accident nobody fully understood at the time made the walls mildly resistant to mould and vermin as well. There is something almost poetic sitting underneath all of this if you are willing to look for it. A wall built this way is not sealed, not in the way we tend to think good building material should be sealed today. Clay and lime remain even after fully curing gently permeable, letting a small amount of moisture pass slowly through, rather than trapping it entirely on one side or the other. In damp weather, the wall could absorb a little humidity from the air inside the house. In drier stretches, it released that same moisture back out again slowly, evenly, almost breathing along with the seasons the same way the timber frame itself flexed, with the wind rather than fighting it outright. It is not a coincidence, I think, that the very same instinct shows up again and again throughout this entire style of building work with the material's natural behavior rather than forcing it into submission, because these were people who had learned the hard way exactly what happened to a structure that tried to do the opposite. I bring this up partly because it honestly reshaped how I think about the word primitive, a word that gets attached to this kind of building far too easily and far too often. A modern wall built airtight and sealed against every draft on purpose actually has to be engineered quite carefully to avoid trapping moisture inside its own layers, because trapped moisture is exactly what breeds rot and mould behind a wall nobody can see into. A daub wall never had that particular problem to begin with, not because anyone in that village understood vapor permeability in the way a modern building scientist would explain it, but because the material itself simply behaved that way by nature, and centuries of trial and error had quietly steered every choice, the clay, the straw, the lime, toward working with that behavior instead of against it. Sometimes the smartest engineering decision is simply knowing when not to fight the material you're holding. Of course not. Every wall got the ratio right, and it is worth being honest about that rather than making the whole process sound effortless. Too much clay and not enough straw, and a wall could crack along an entire face within its very first winter opening seams a person could plainly feel a draft through on a cold night. Too much sand and too little clay, and the whole mixture simply refused to hold together at all, crumbling away from the wattle in dry chunks before it ever had the chance to properly cure. Skip the animal hair rush, the drying apply a layer far too thick because you were in a hurry to finish before the rain came in, and you were guaranteed to be standing right back at that same wall within a year patching it all over again. Weather made its own demands too, ones no amount of skill could fully outrun. Daub needed a reasonable stretch of dry, mild weather to cure properly, which meant timing mattered almost as much as technique. Apply it too late in the autumn, with the first hard frosts already threatening, and the moisture still sitting inside the mixture could freeze before it ever finished curing, splitting the whole patch apart from the inside the moment the ground finally thawed. Families paid close attention to the calendar for exactly this reason, favouring the warmer, drier stretches of spring and summer for any major daubing work and saving the colder months for repairs, small enough to shelter properly while they set. None of this was written down as a formal set of rules anywhere a family could simply go and check. It lived entirely in memory, in the particular feel of the mixture between two fingers, in watching your own mother or father correct a batch that was clearly too wet and quietly filing that lesson away for the very first time you tried it yourself. So there it is, the wall itself, woven wood and reinforced clay working together as one continuous breathing surface wrapped entirely around a skeleton of pegged oak. And with the frame filled in, and the walls finally closed against the weather, there was really only one part of the house left completely exposed to the sky above it, the one surface that had to do the hardest job of all, keeping an entire family dry through whatever a long English winter decided to throw down on top of them. Now, I did just promise you a roof, and we will get there, I promise. But before we put one over Watt's head, I want to pull the camera back for a moment, because his little house, as clever as it was only one version of a much larger story, playing out across the entire continent at more or less the same time. And I think you will enjoy this part, because it turns out the whole idea of building without cement was not some quiet English secret. It was Europe's shared unspoken default setting for most of 1,000 years, and different corners of that same continent solved the exact same basic problem in wildly different ways. Here is the thing worth sitting with before we go any further. None of these differences came down to which culture was cleverer, or which people simply had not figured out the good idea yet. every single regional style we're about to walk through was built from precisely whatever the ground underfoot happened to provide, shaped by precisely whatever the local weather demanded, refined over centuries by people who had never travelled more than a day or two beyond the village where they were born. Change the geology under your feet, and the entire architectural tradition of a region changes right along with it, sometimes within the space of a single river valley. It is a slightly different lesson than the one we drew earlier when we talked about money and land and who could and could not afford lime mortar. This time the deciding factor was not a lord's ledger or a family's place on that Domesday ladder. It was simply geology, rainfall, and whatever a particular stretch of coastline had spent millions of years quietly depositing underfoot, long before a single medieval family ever arrived to make use of it. Take the southwestern corner of England, Devon and Cornwall in particular, not so terribly far from where Wat and Agnes were living their own lives. If you had wandered through that countryside, you would barely have recognised the building method as belonging to the same broad tradition we just spent an entire stretch of this story unpacking. There was no timber skeleton standing underneath the walls at all, no cruck frame, no pegged mortise and tenon joints holding anything up. Builders in that region worked with something called cob, a thick monolithic mixture of clay, rich subsoil, sand and straw, built directly on top of a low stone foundation, in a slow, patient series of layers sometimes called lifts, each one left to firm up for days before the next was piled on top. The wall itself was the entire structure. It did not need a wooden frame to lean on because at nearly 2 feet thick in most surviving examples, sometimes closer to 3, the cob simply held its own weight, rising story by story purely through the strength of well-mixed clay and time. Building that way came with its own strange, satisfying rhythm. Workers, sometimes with the help of oxen trampling the raw mixture underfoot to work it evenly, would fork great heaps of the stuff up onto the rising wall, tread it firm, trim the excess from the edges once it had set just enough to hold a clean line, and then simply wait sometimes an entire week before adding the next course on top. It was slower than framing a house in oak, in some ways far slower, but it produced walls with an almost startling amount of thermal mass soaking up the day's warmth and releasing it slowly overnight, keeping a Devon cottage noticeably cooler in summer and warmer in winter than you might expect from a wall made of nothing more exotic than dirt. Think about how differently that entire process would have felt compared to Wat's raising day. No dramatic single afternoon where neighbours gathered to heave an entire wall upright at once. No cracking of pegs being driven home, no shouted counts. Just weeks, sometimes months of quiet, repetitive labour. One patient layer settling into the next. A building that grew the way a loaf of bread rises rather than the way a skeleton gets assembled piece by piece. 2 entirely different rhythms of construction, separated by only a few hundred miles of English countryside, both arriving at a house that could comfortably shelter a family for centuries, and it worked remarkably well for an extraordinarily long time. Historians estimate there are still something like 40,000 cob buildings standing across Devon and Cornwall. Today homes and farm outbuildings alike, some tracing their origins all the way back to the 1300s. There is an old saying that apparently circulated through that part of England for generations, and I love it because it captures the entire philosophy in a single breath. All cob wants, the saying goes, is a good hat and a good pair of shoes. Keep the roof sound and the foundation dry. In other words, protect a cob wall from water at the top and the bottom, and the mud itself will comfortably outlive the person who built it, and quite possibly their grandchildren as well. Why did this particular region lean so heavily toward cob instead of the timber framing Wat and his neighbours relied on? Partly it comes down to exactly what we would expect by now, whatever the ground offered most generously. Devon and Cornwall sit on rich workable clay subsoil, while good structural timber, especially the long straight or gently curved oak, that cruck framing demanded was noticeably scarcer in parts of that landscape than it was further north and east. So the building tradition adapted not because anyone there lacked the skill or the imagination to raise a timber frame, but because the wiser bet generation after generation was clearly sitting right there underfoot the entire time. It is worth remembering too that plenty of Devon cob buildings still use some timber, a modest frame of split oak resting on a stone footing a roof structure overhead, small lintels bridging a door or a window. Cob rarely stood in complete isolation from wood. It simply reduced the role timber needed to play, leaning far more heavily on the clay itself to carry the weight that Watt's oak frame carried almost entirely on its own. Now travel across the water into what is today Germany, and you find an entirely different answer again, though one built from a strangely familiar starting point. German carpenters worked with the exact same basic ingredients. Watt did a timber skeleton filled between the beams, except here the timber itself was rarely hidden away behind daub, the way it usually was in England. It was celebrated left fully exposed on the outside of the building, forming those unmistakable dark crisscrossing patterns against pale plaster that most people picture instantly the moment you say the words German Old Town. Builders there called the technique Fachwerk, and the regional variation within Germany alone is honestly staggering. Robust, heavy-set beams, favoured in the trade rich north, elaborately carved and ornamented timber further inland, where mining and farming wealth encouraged a bit of architectural showing off each region, essentially signing its own name into the wood. What fascinates me most about Fachwerk, though, is how openly it treated the timber frame as decoration rather than something to be politely covered up. English builders, remember, buried that same structural skeleton under a layer of daub and eventually limewash, hiding the very craftsmanship holding the whole house together. German carpenters working with more or less the same underlying joinery. We spent an entire earlier stretch of this story examining, chose instead to put it on full display, carving dates, patterns, sometimes entire biblical scenes directly into beams that were never meant to be hidden from a single passerby. Same skeleton, completely different relationship with showing it off. And honestly, I find something rather charming about a culture that looked at its own structural engineering and decided the neighbours ought to be allowed to admire it too. One town in particular is worth pausing on, a place called Quedlinburg, tucked at the edge of the Harz Mountains, which still has somewhere in the range of 13 or 1400 surviving half-timbered buildings crowded into its old town centre, an almost absurd concentration of medieval and early modern carpentry, all standing shoulder to shoulder along the same narrow streets. And here is a detail I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets. For roughly 800 years, that same town was governed not by a lord or a duke in the way you might expect, but by a line of abbesses, women holding real formal political authority over an entire medieval territory, at a time when that arrangement was almost nowhere else the norm. I like sitting with that fact for a moment because it is a useful reminder that the story of medieval Europe was never quite as uniformly male-dominated as the popular picture sometimes suggests, and that some of the very towns best known today for their beautifully preserved timber architecture were for centuries run by women. And then there is a third answer more extreme than either of the first two, sitting out along the wild wind-battered edge of the Atlantic. Off the southwest coast of Ireland, on a jagged storm-lashed pinnacle of rock called Skellig Michael, a small community of monks starting sometime around the 6th century built themselves a set of stone huts, using a method that eliminated an entire category of material altogether. No timber at all, because virtually nothing grew tall enough to use on that bare salt-scoured crag. No mud daub either, since there was barely enough soil up there to grow a garden, let alone mix a wall. just stone-stacked stone using a technique called corbelling, where each ring of flat stone sits very slightly further inward than the ring beneath it, curving gradually inward, course by course, until the whole structure seals itself shut at the top in a single capping stone forming a shape people understandably nicknamed a beehive hut. Try to picture the sheer patience it required for a moment, because I think it is easy to read past a sentence like that without truly absorbing what it describes. Every single stone in that wall had to be selected and placed with the next inward step, already calculated in the builder's mind, no timber frame to hold anything steady, while the shape came together, no scaffolding beyond whatever the monks could balance on. One badly chosen stone sitting even slightly wrong, and the whole delicate inward curve could shift out of true. And they were doing this work, remember, not in some sheltered inland valley, but on a wind-raked Atlantic crag where hauling material even a short distance meant climbing rock that pilgrims still find seriously difficult today, using nothing more than their own hands, their own backs, and an evidently formidable amount of communal patience. No mortar, no binding material of any kind, cement or otherwise, holding a single one of those stones in place, purely the careful, patient geometry of weight, leaning against weight. And these structures have survived largely intact for roughly 1,400 years, weathering Atlantic storms that regularly bring winds strong enough to make the gale we open this whole story with look almost gentle by comparison. If you want a single image that captures just how far medieval builders could push the basic idea of building without cement, I honestly cannot think of a better one than a handful of monks on a rain-lashed rock stacking loose stone into a dome, and having that dome still standing there today, patiently outlasting nearly every empire that has risen and fallen since the day the last stone was set. Film crews incidentally found the location striking enough to shoot scenes for a rather famous science fiction saga on that very island a few years back, which always makes me smile, a little medieval monastic architecture doubling as an alien world without needing a single alteration. Does it not strike you as a little remarkable that three completely different solutions, mud walls in Devon timber lattices in Germany, bare stacked stone off the Irish coast, were all in their own way answering the exact same underlying question? How do you keep a family, or in the case of those monks, a small isolated community, warm, dry, and standing through the very worst a northern European sky could throw at them, using nothing but what the land immediately around you was willing to give? I think the honest answer is that there was never really one correct way to build a home in medieval Europe. There were only correct answers for a particular patch of ground, a particular climate, a particular stretch of coastline or forest or clay bed, worked out slowly by people who had absolutely no other option but to pay very close attention to their own surroundings. 3 regions, 3 completely different sets of raw materials, and yet underneath all of it, the exact same underlying discipline. Watch the land, listen to what it is already offering you, and stop fighting it long enough to actually notice. The next time you happen to scroll past a photograph of a black and white timbered German square, or a rounded sugar-white Devon cottage, or even one of those strange stone domes perched on an Irish sea crag, it might be worth pausing for half a second and asking yourself a slightly different question than usual. Not simply how pretty the building looks, but what that particular wall is quietly telling you about the ground it happens to be standing on, and about the generations of ordinary unnamed people who spent their whole lives learning to read that ground correctly. So let's bring this back home now, quite literally, to that one particular house near the Humber, standing there with its frame raised and its walls finely closed in against the weather clay and woven branches, doing their patient work exactly the way we described a little earlier. what still had one problem left, and it was in its own way the most urgent of them all. Above his head, between those two curved oak timbers meeting at the peak, there was still nothing but open sky, and an English winter has never once shown much patience for a family waiting around underneath one. Right, the sky, let's finally deal with the sky. Everything we have talked about so far, the timber, the daub, the careful choice of ground beneath it all existed for exactly one final purpose, holding up whatever went on top. And what went on top for the overwhelming majority of houses across the English countryside was straw. Not shingles, not tile, certainly nothing resembling the roofing you would find on a house today. Bundle after bundle of dried cereal straw layered by hand into something that had to do an almost unreasonable amount of work keeping an entire family dry through decades of English rain, while somehow also standing up to exactly the kind of gale that opened this whole story in the first place. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. When I first started reading about thatched roofs, I carried around the same lazy assumption I suspect a lot of people carry, that thatch was simply what poor people used before somebody invented something better, a stopgap material waiting patiently to be replaced by tile or slate, the moment anyone could afford the upgrade. The deeper I got into the actual engineering behind it, the more embarrassed I became of that assumption, and I think by the end of this part you might feel a similar way. Let's start with the shape of the thing, because it turns out the angle of a roof is not a stylistic choice at all. It is quite literally the entire secret. A thatched roof needs a steep pitch somewhere around 45 to 50 degrees at minimum, and that number was never arbitrary. Water, when it lands on a shallow slope, lingers. It seeps sideways, works its way between fibres, finds every tiny gap patience and gravity can locate. Water landing on a steep enough slope simply does not have time to do any of that. It runs fast, straight off the surface, spending only a few seconds in contact with the thatch before it drops harmlessly to the ground below. A roof built too shallow, even using the exact same materials and the exact same skilled hands, would fail within a single hard winter. Not because the straw itself was weak, but because the angle gave the weather far too much time to work its way in. Once you have the angle right, the next question is what you are actually layering onto it. And this is where, once again, geography quietly made the decision for you. Families working, land suited to grain crops, generally thatched with straw wheat or rye, sometimes a deliberate mixture of both that thatchers called maslin. And here is a detail from the historical record that properly surprised me the first time I came across it. Medieval wheat. The actual variety growing in English fields at the time was not the short, stiff, mechanically harvested crop we picture today. It grew tall sometimes, reaching close to 6 feet in height, even on fairly poor soil, producing long, strong, remarkably durable stalks. Ideal both for baking bread and once the grain had been threshed away for laying over a roof. In wetter, marshier regions, particularly the fens of eastern England, thatchers reached instead for water-reed, a hollow, waxy-stemmed plant that shed rain even more efficiently than straw, and in the right conditions could last on a roof for closer to 70 years before needing to be fully replaced. Getting that raw material onto the roof properly was its own specialised trade, distinct enough from ordinary building work that it usually fell to someone who did nothing else. Straw was gathered into tight even bundles the thatchers called yelms, then carried up and layered across the roof in overlapping courses, working steadily from the eaves at the bottom toward the ridge at the very top, each new course covering roughly 2/3 of the one beneath it, so that water was always sliding down onto solid unbroken thatch rather than finding a seam to slip through. And here is where that earlier conversation about coppiced woodland pays off again, in a way I did not expect when we first talked about it. The bundles were pinned in place using thin, twisted lengths of hazel split and bent into a shape thatchers called a spar, essentially a hand-carved staple, driven directly through the layered straw and down into the timber below. The exact same managed woodland supplying flexible wattle for the walls was at the very same time quietly supplying the fasteners, holding the entire roof together. I find something quietly satisfying in that particular overlap, honestly. Nothing about this house was ever really separate from anything else about it. The same coppiced hazel rod that might have been woven into a wall panel a season earlier could, cut and twisted differently, end up pinning straw to a roof the following spring. One managed patch of woodland quietly supplying an entire household's worth of separate building needs year after year without anyone involved needing to think of it as anything more remarkable than simply how things were done. A skilled thatcher also carried a particular tool for this work, a flat-ridged wooden paddle called a legget, used to beat and dress each new course of straw into a tight, even weather-tight surface. Once it was pinned in place, tapping the loose ends flush and knocking the whole layer into a uniform slope that would shed water evenly, rather than pooling anywhere along an uneven edge. Watching a good thatcher work by every account that survives was something close to watching a craftsman finish a piece of furniture. The same patient, repetitive attention paid to a material most of us would walk straight past without a second thought. This is actually the part I find most impressive about the whole system, and I want to slow down on it properly because it explains something that truly surprised me the first time I understood the mechanics. You would think a roof made from loose dried plant material would be the first thing torn apart in a violent storm, the kind of storm we spent our very first stretch of this story sitting through, and yet thatched roofs built and maintained correctly hold up against high wind remarkably well, often better than roofing systems we would consider far more modern and sturdy. The reason comes down to exactly how the material is fixed in place. A tiled roof, or a roof of individual wooden shingles, is essentially a collection of separate, discrete pieces, each one relying on gravity and a single nail or peg to stay put. Give the wind a strong enough angle to slip beneath just one of those pieces, and it can peel the whole covering apart piece by piece, the same way you might lift the corner of a rug and drag the entire thing loose. Thatch does not work that way at all. Every single bundle is spare-pinned directly into the layer beneath it, and that layer into the layer beneath that, all the way down to the timber laths fixed across the rafters. The wind cannot get underneath any single piece because there is no single piece to get underneath. The entire roof behaves as one continuous, densely woven mat tied at every point to the timber frame we spent so much time building earlier, becoming in the truest sense part of the house, rather than something merely resting on top of it. I actually think this connects rather beautifully to something we noticed with the wattle and daub walls a little earlier too. Do you remember that idea of working with a material's natural behaviour instead of fighting it? The roof does exactly the same thing, just facing a different direction. The wall breathes with moisture. The roof in its own way breathes with the wind densely packed enough to resist it, yet never rigid enough to catch it the way a flat, unbroken surface would. It is worth asking yourself honestly, how many modern building materials could make that same claim, standing up to a genuine gale, not by being harder or heavier than the wind pushing against them, but by simply refusing to give the wind anything solid to grab hold of in the first place. Now here is a fact I think deserves a proper pause because it turns thatched roofs into something closer to a time capsule than most people realise. When a roof needed attention, thatchers rarely stripped the whole thing down to bare timber and started fresh. Far more often only the weathered outer surface was removed, and an entirely new layer was simply added directly on top of whatever remained underneath, a practice sometimes called spar coating. Do that decade after decade, century after century, and the thatch itself slowly accumulates layer stacked upon layer, sometimes growing more than 7 feet thick on the oldest surviving roofs in England. Researchers studying these ancient base layers, the material sitting right at the very bottom, closest to the original timber, have identified more than 250 roofs across southern England, where that original coat was laid down over 500 years ago and never fully removed since, quietly surviving underneath every subsequent repair like the rings hidden inside a tree trunk. Botanists studying that oldest layer have actually been able to identify the specific cropsweed seeds and even insect remains preserved inside it, a genuine physical library of late medieval farming sealed away and forgotten, under everything laid on top, later waiting 5 centuries for somebody to finally think to look. I find that almost unbearably moving, if I am honest with you. A roof is usually the last thing we think of as a record of anything, and yet somewhere in the English countryside right now, there is straw sitting under a much newer, much tidier looking thatch, cut from a wheat field that has not existed in that particular shape for over 500 years, holding inside it seeds and fragments no history book ever bothered to write down. Consider for a second everything that had to go right for that fragile little scrap of 500-year-old plant matter to survive intact. It had to stay dry enough not to rot. It had to stay undisturbed by every single rethatching that happened above it across 24 or so generations. And it had to wait patiently sealed in darkness until a researcher with the right training happened to peel back the right corner of the right roof at exactly the right moment to notice it was there at all. Of course, none of this happened without real serious weight resting on the timber frame underneath. A finished thatched roof is heavy, sometimes carrying close to the weight of a grown adult, pressing down on every single square metre of surface weight that had to be accounted for the moment what first shaped those cruck beams and pegged the rafters into place. Get the underlying frame wrong, undersized, poorly braced, insufficiently pegged, and it was not the wind that brought a roof down in the end. It was the accumulated patient pressure of the thatch itself slowly working a poorly built structure apart from directly above, long before any storm ever arrived to finish the job. And the ridge, that narrow strip running along the very peak of the roof where 2 slopes meet, took the worst punishment of all, exposed constantly to sun, wind and driving rain from every direction at once. It wore out faster than the rest of the roof by a wide margin, which meant most households expected to have that particular section renewed roughly once a decade, even on a roof whose main body might comfortably last 50 years or more without serious attention. Skilled thatchers finished it with a distinctive rolled or patterned cap, partly for practical weatherproofing, and I suspect partly because after weeks of demanding physical, unglamorous labour, a person is entitled to leave one small flourish behind that says unmistakably a craftsman did this. There is a lesson tucked inside that ridge maintenance pattern too, one worth carrying forward with us, because we're going to run into a version of it again before this story is finished. Nobody in that village expected the whole roof to fail at once, and nobody treated the entire structure as something you simply built once, and then ignored for the rest of your life. Maintenance was built into the very design from the beginning, small regular attention paid to the section, under the most stress long before it ever became a full-blown emergency. A house like this was never really finished in the way we might use that word today. It was an ongoing relationship between a family and the materials sheltering them, checked, patched and renewed in careful stages for as long as anyone lived inside it. Picture what then on the day the roof finally went up no longer, the loud communal chaos of the raising day we described earlier, but something quieter, more solitary, a hired thatcher, or perhaps simply the most patient man in the village working steadily from the bottom edge upward, bundle after bundle, spar after spar, while the rest of the household carried fresh straw up from below and I would guess offered a fairly constant stream of unsolicited advice from the safety of the ground. By the time the final ridge cap went on that bare exposed skeleton of oak we watched go up earlier had become something else entirely, a fully closed weatherproof shelter walls that could breathe a roof that could shrug off a gale rather than surrender to it, all of it built without a single bag of cement anywhere in the entire structure. There was still one more piece of that house left to account for, though, and it might be the most surprising one of all. Because for all that careful engineering keeping the weather firmly on the outside right at the very centre of the floor, Agnes and Watt deliberately kept something burning that filled the air inside with smoke every single day of their lives, and understanding why tells you almost everything about what daily life actually felt like. Behind those walls we just spent so long building. Here is a question that might sound a little strange at first. Why on earth would anyone deliberately keep a fire burning inside a house, built entirely from timber-dried grass and packed clay every single day, for the family's entire life inside it? It sounds almost reckless sitting a source of flame directly beneath a roof made of straw. And yet that fire sat right there in the middle of the floor for centuries in house after house across England, and once you understand why I think the whole design of these homes starts to click into place in a way it has not quite done yet. It is worth remembering too that this was not simply an English habit or a quirk of one particular region. Walk into a rural home almost anywhere in Europe during these same centuries, from the fenlands of eastern England to the farming valleys of Germany, and you would find some version of the exact same arrangement, a fire kept low and constant, right at the centre of whatever single room the household actually lived in. It was in its own quiet way one of the most universal design decisions in the entire medieval world, arrived at independently over and over by people who had never met each other and never would. The fire stayed in the centre of the room for one very deliberate reason. Push it up against a wall and you place an open flame directly beside daubed timber and thatch eaves, exactly the materials you least want anywhere near sustained heat. Keep it in the middle instead, with the ceiling rising high above it, all the way to the open apex of the roof, and the flame has room to breathe. Sparks have distance to cool before they ever reach anything flammable, and smoke has a long, unhurried climb before it meets the thatch at all. The whole central hall of a house like Watt's was built tall and open for exactly this reason, not for grandeur but because a fire needs space above it, the same way a person needs space to think clearly. Height was safety long before anyone thought to write that principle down. And where did all that smoke actually go once it had drifted up past the rafters? Sometimes through a simple gap left open at the ridge, sometimes through a slightly more deliberate structure called a louvre, a small lantern-shaped opening built into the roof itself with angled boards on its sides that let smoke escape while still keeping most of the rain out. Archaeologists studying surviving roof timbers today can often locate exactly where a hearth once stood, in a house that vanished centuries ago purely by tracing the pattern of soot and tar staining left behind on the wood, a kind of permanent shadow burned into the frame by decades of daily fires. Here is the detail I find most delightful in this whole arrangement, though, because it turns what sounds like an obvious flaw into something closer to quiet genius. That smoke curling up through the thatch was not simply an unfortunate byproduct the family had to tolerate. It was doing real useful work on its way out. The tar and resin carried in wood smoke settled into the straw as it passed through, gradually waterproofing the thatch from the inside, sealing it against exactly the kind of driving rain we spent an entire earlier stretch of this story discussing. That same smoke also killed off the insects that would otherwise have happily made a home in several feet of dry, undisturbed straw sitting directly above a warm house. and any household lucky enough to have a bit of meat to spare could hang it up in those same rafters, curing gently in the slow drift of daily smoke, a side benefit that turned an ordinary cooking fire into a functioning smokehouse without anyone needing to build a separate structure for it. One fire, 3 completely different jobs, none of them planned out on paper, all of them simply understood, generation after generation, as how a house was supposed to work. Let's actually walk through the space itself for a moment, because a cruck-framed house like Watt's was rarely just one undivided room, even though it might look that way from outside. These houses were typically built in 3 sections or bays running along the length of the frame. The central bay held the open hall we've been describing, hearth-high ceiling, no floor above it at all, the heart of daily life. One of the 2 end bays usually served as working space storage, a place to keep tools, grain, whatever the household could not risk leaving outdoors. The other end bay, though, often did have an upper level tucked in above it, a modest loft reached by a simple ladder, and that loft was where the family actually slept, tucked up above the working part of the house, away from the smoke and the worst of the ground floor chill, close enough to the chimney bay's warmth to still benefit from it. It is a surprisingly sensible little floor plan, honestly. Cooking and gathering space, storage space and sleeping space, each with its own dedicated section of the same simple frame. Think about what that actually meant for a family's daily rhythm. Climb down that ladder each morning, and you stepped almost directly into the warm, smoky heart of the house, the fire likely already stirred back to life, the smell of the previous night's meal probably still lingering faintly in the rushes underfoot. There was no real separation between waking up and being fully back inside the working, breathing centre of the household, no private morning quiet before facing the day. Everything happened in view of everything else, cooking beside sleeping, beside storage, beside whatever conversation was already underway by the fire. It is a way of living that probably sounds almost uncomfortably close for many of us watching this tonight, and yet I suspect it also meant a kind of constant low-grade togetherness that a lot of modern homes spread out over separate rooms and separate floors have quietly lost somewhere along the way. I want to pause here on something that quietly reshaped how historians themselves have talked about these houses, because it connects directly to a myth we have already been quietly dismantling throughout this whole story. For a very long time, the accepted historical view was that peasant houses simply could not have survived from the medieval period at all that they were, and I am not exaggerating the old academic language here, hardly more than crude huts thrown together from scavenged timber and mud, destined to collapse and be rebuilt within a single generation. It was in a sense a convenient assumption, because it meant nobody needed to go looking for surviving examples. If a peasant house could not possibly have lasted this long, why bother checking whether one actually had? Then, starting a couple of decades ago, a team of researchers funded through the Leverhulme Trust set out to properly test that assumption, using tree ring dating, examining timber, cut directly from cruck-framed houses scattered across the English Midlands. What they found quietly overturned decades of settled academic opinion. Thousands of authentically medieval peasant houses are still standing today, hiding in plain sight, absorbed into later brick extensions, plastered over, modernized on the outside, while the original cruck frame, sometimes dating back to the 12 or 1300s, remains fully intact underneath. Some of these houses are still lived in right now this evening by families who may have no idea that the beams above their heads were cut and pegged together, while the Black Death was still an active, terrifying memory, rather than a line in a textbook. Doesn't it change something knowing that the humble little house we've spent so much of this story imagining was never actually as fragile or as temporary as we have been trained to assume? The old picture of the medieval peasant, hunched, half-starving, living in a hovel, barely holding itself together, turns out to owe more to later prejudice than to the physical evidence sitting quietly in roof timbers all across the English countryside waiting patiently for somebody to finally bother looking up. Now down at the ground itself beneath everyone's feet, the floor of a house like this was almost always compacted earth, sometimes mixed with a bit of clay or lime to help it bind and resist wear. And directly on top of that bare earth, households across medieval England laid down a covering of rushes or straw, a practice generally called strewing. It served several purposes at once, cushioning the floor, adding a small measure of insulation against the cold, rising up from the ground, and soaking up the inevitable spills, scraps, and general mess of daily household life. Fresh herbs were often worked in among the rushes too, not for decoration exactly, but because a house lived in every single day with a fire burning constantly, and food prepared right there on the same floor could use every bit of help it could get, keeping smells and pests under some kind of control. Mint, lavender, chamomile, whatever grew nearby and smelled pleasant underfoot, scattered in among the rushes so that every footstep released a small burst of fragrance into a room that otherwise smelled fairly heavily of wood smoke animals, and whatever supper happened to be simmering. This was not a floor anybody expected to stay perfectly fresh either, and it is worth being honest about that rather than romanticizing it. Those rushes were typically only swept out and fully replaced once or twice a year, which meant that for months at a stretch, a household was quite literally walking on an accumulating layer of dropped crumbs, spilled ale, and whatever the family dog happened to track in from outside. The herbs were doing real necessary work in that gap between full cleanings, not simply adding a pleasant scent but actively holding back the smell, and to some degree the pests that came with living so closely on top of your own daily mess for weeks on end. The furniture filling that space, if we can even call it furniture in the way we would use that word now, stayed deliberately sparse. A sturdy wooden chest or two doubling as both storage and seating, since a chest lid makes a perfectly reasonable bench when nothing better is available. Simple benches drawn up near the hearth. Earthenware and in slightly better off households, brass pots and pans along with flat baking stones set directly among the coals for bread. By the middle of the 1300s, some families had even started using a clever iron grate called a brandreth, raised slightly above the flames, letting a pot sit steady over even heat, rather than balanced awkwardly among burning logs, an early, humble ancestor of the cooking range sitting in kitchens today. And every single night before anyone in that household finally lay down in the loft above, someone had one last small job to do banking the fire. Rather than let it burn itself out completely and face the genuine chore of striking a fresh flame from scratch, the next morning families across much of medieval Europe covered the glowing embers with a simple ceramic or tile lid holding just enough heat and just enough air to keep a spark quietly alive through the night, without any risk of the flame spreading while everyone slept. In parts of France, that nightly ritual covering the fire was called exactly that, in the local language couvre-feu. And if that phrase sounds oddly familiar, it should, because English eventually borrowed it wholesale and wore it down over the centuries into a word we still use constantly today, for an entirely different kind of evening restriction curfew. Every time you hear that word now, you are, whether you realized it or not, hearing a small, perfectly preserved fossil of a medieval family quietly putting their hearth to bed for the night. It is a strange, quiet kind of immortality when you think about it properly. Nobody remembers the name of the very first household that started covering their embers this way each evening. No chronicle recorded the moment the habit spread from one village to the next, house by house, region by region, until it had settled itself into daily life across half of Europe. and yet the word survived anyway, outliving the fires it was named for by the better part of 1,000 years, tucked into a language most of those original families would not even recognize if they heard it spoken today. I like sitting with that image for a moment before we move on, honestly. The very last thing that happened in a house like Watt and Agnes's every single evening without fail was this small, careful act of tending the fire that kept them alive, making sure it survived the night the same patient way the walls and the roof had been built to survive the years. Warmth was never something that simply happened in that house. It was something the whole family actively looked after morning and night for as long as anyone lived inside those walls. And now that we have walked all the way through this house from the ground, it was chosen to stand on through its bones, its skin, its roof, and finally the fire kept burning at its very heart. I think we're finally ready to go back to where this whole story began. Back to that one particular night, the wind rising off the North Sea, the water climbing higher than anyone alive had ever seen it climb, stone towers coming down all along that coast, while one small house made of nothing more than bent wood and dried mud simply held its ground. Because now we actually know enough to answer the question we left hanging in the dark all that time ago, why exactly that house was still standing when the sun finally came up. Let's go back now. All the way back to that night, we started with the wind screaming in off the North Sea water, climbing higher than anyone alive had ever seen it climb, a small house near the Humber, shaking in the dark while somewhere down the coast, entire towns were simply being erased from the map. We know the walls by now. We know the roof, the frame, the fire kept burning at the centre of it all. So let's finally answer the question we left hanging in that darkness all this time ago. Why exactly did that house make it through the night when buildings raised by kings did not? I've been looking forward to this moment for a while now, honestly, because every single piece we have carefully laid out across this whole story, the timber, the daub, the roof, the fire has actually been building quietly toward this one answer. Nothing you have heard so far was simply background detail. It was evidence gathered piece by piece, and now we finally get to put it all together in the one place it was always meant to matter most. The honest answer has almost nothing to do with luck, and almost everything to do with a single word most of us rarely think about when we picture strength, and that word is flexibility. Here is the piece most people miss entirely when they picture a medieval stone tower, the kind that came down all along that coast that same night. Stone feels indestructible. It is heavy. It is hard. It does not bend under normal pressure the way a green branch does. And that is exactly the problem. A tall structure built from rigid mortared stone has essentially one strategy for dealing with a powerful, sustained gale, standing perfectly still and refusing to move an inch. For most of any given year, that strategy works beautifully, but refuse to move at all while an enormous sustained lateral force pushes against you for hour after hour, and every ounce of that force has to go somewhere. It concentrates. It gathers at the weakest points in the structure, at mortar joints at the base, where the tower meets the ground, at any hairline crack already sitting quietly in the stonework. From years of smaller storms nobody thought twice about, stone does not bend to release that pressure. It holds and holds and holds right up until the exact moment it simply cannot hold any longer, and then it does not creak a warning or lean gradually to one side. It fails suddenly, catastrophically, all at once, the entire accumulated stress of hours finally finding release in a single violent moment. Think of it this way for a second if it helps. A reed bends in a strong current and comes up straight again the moment the water calms. A brittle dry twig held rigid in exactly the same current does not bend at all, right up until the instant it simply snaps in two. Medieval builders never had access to wind tunnels or stress calculations, obviously, but they had several lifetimes of watching exactly this pattern play out in reed beds in forests after a storm in their own collapsed neighbours' walls, and they built accordingly whether or not anyone ever wrote the underlying physics down in so many words. We actually have a rather stunning example of exactly this pattern playing out, though, from a slightly later storm than the one we opened with. For roughly 238 years, the tallest structure anywhere on the planet was not in Rome, not in Constantinople, but rising quietly over the flat countryside of Lincolnshire, England, the spire crowning Lincoln Cathedral, reaching higher into the sky than any building human beings had ever raised before it. And then, in the middle of the 1500s, a storm came through, and that spire, the tallest thing on Earth for nearly 2.5 centuries, simply came down. All that height, all that stone, all the accumulated mortar and skilled masonry, and in the end it met the exact same fate as 100 smaller, humbler stone towers across England, undone not by weakness in the material itself, but by rigidity, by an inability to give even slightly to a force that had absolutely no intention of giving way first. And Lincoln was not some isolated, unlucky exception either, which I think matters quite a lot here. Wander through the history of English cathedral spires, and you find a remarkably striking pattern repeating itself storm after storm, century after century. The spire at Malmesbury Abbey gone, the great spire once crowning Old St. Paul's in London, among the tallest ever built anywhere in Europe, gone as well, brought down not by an invading army but by weather. Chichester Cathedral's spire stood for more than 400 years before a stormy night finally finished off cracks that had been quietly widening for decades, the whole structure coming down the following morning in a matter of seconds. These were not poorly funded, hastily built structures either. Some of the finest masons and engineers medieval Europe ever produced worked on these towers, spending years, sometimes entire lifetimes, perfecting the stonework. And still, again and again, wind proved to be the one opponent rigid stone consistently struggled to answer. Now think about Watts House standing that same kind of night, and remember everything we have carefully built up piece by piece across this whole story. Those two great curved oak beams meeting at the peak of the roof, cut and shaped from green still living timber, were never trying to stand perfectly rigid against the gale the way a stone tower does. They were built quite deliberately to sway. Remember the pegs holding every single joint together, the ones we call trenails driven through deliberately offset holes, so the whole connection pulls itself tighter under load rather than working itself loose. Under normal conditions, that peg simply holds two timbers firmly in place. Under the kind of violent sustained pressure the Grota Mandrenka was throwing at that coastline, something more interesting happens. Wood itself has a small amount of natural give, and a peg driven through a slightly offset hole has an even smaller amount of room to shift and settle under real strain. Multiply that tiny amount of movement across dozens of joints throughout an entire frame, and the whole structure gains something a rigid stone tower can never have the ability to absorb a portion of the wind's energy through hundreds of small harmless movements instead of resisting it as one single unbending mass. The wattle and daub walls did something remarkably similar in their own quieter way. We talked earlier about how that woven lattice of hazel flexed slightly under load, rather than holding perfectly still the daub, gripping tight to the wattle, yet never behaving like a single solid brittle sheet the way a stone wall does. A crack forming in daub tends to stay small, contained absorbed locally by the fibrous straw running through the mixture, rather than racing across an entire rigid surface the way a fracture spreads through unforgiving mortar and stone. Even the thatch played its part, that densely tied layer we spent so long describing. offering the wind nothing solid and flat to push against nothing it could catch and peel the way it caught the lead sheeting and heavy stonework of a cathedral roof. Every single choice we have walked through across this entire story, choices that taken individually might have looked like small, unremarkable pieces of folk tradition, turns out to have been quietly pointing toward this exact outcome the whole time. The bent oak, the offset peg, the fibrous forgiving daub, the tightly bound weight-distributing thatch. None of it was designed by a single engineer sitting down with a plan. It accumulated choice by choice mistake by corrected mistake across generations, until it happened to add up to a structure that on one particular violent night behaved almost exactly like the very best defensive engineering the modern world would not properly understand and name for another 600 years. Put all of that together and you get a structure that behaved that particular night less like a fortress and more like a living thing leaning with the gale, absorbing it, giving back exactly enough to survive without ever once presenting the wind with a single unmovable surface large enough to build catastrophic pressure against. It was never really a fight between the storm and the house. It was closer to a negotiation, the same word we used earlier to describe how a crock frame relates to the tree it came from. And once again, the house negotiating with nature came out ahead of the one trying to command it into submission. Do you know where else in the world people arrived at almost exactly this same solution, working completely independently with no possible contact between the two traditions? Halfway around the planet in Japan, standing at a temple called Horyuji, there is a wooden pagoda that has stood by most careful counts for somewhere in the neighborhood of 1300 years, built in a country that experiences some of the most violent earthquakes anywhere on Earth. In all that recorded time, through countless major tremors that have leveled far newer, far more modern buildings around it, no Japanese pagoda has ever been formally recorded as collapsing from an earthquake. The secret engineers who have studied the structure agree lies in a massive central pillar, running up through the middle of the whole building, along with layer after layer of wooden joints that are deliberately allowed to slide and shift very slightly against one another under stress, essentially the exact same drawboard slightly forgiving philosophy Watt's carpenters were using, just refined by a completely different culture for a completely different kind of violent sudden force. Earthquake or gale, it turns out rigid stone answers with cracking and thoughtfully jointed wood answers with a shrug. What fascinates me most is that modern structural engineers working on some of today's tallest skyscrapers have circled right back around to this same basic insight after centuries of building ever more rigid steel and concrete towers. Several contemporary buildings now include deliberately flexible elements, dampers and counterweights designed specifically to let a very tall structure sway a controlled amount in high wind, rather than fighting to hold perfectly still. Engineers openly citing exactly this kind of traditional timber wisdom as part of their inspiration. It took the modern world the better part of 1,000 years, several catastrophic tower collapses, and an entire discipline of structural engineering to formally rediscover something a Yorkshire carpenter and a Japanese temple builder had both already worked out through nothing more than patient trial error and paying close attention to what survived. I find something quietly humbling in that parallel, if I'm honest with you. Two groups of people on opposite sides of the planet who never met, never traded ideas, never read the same books, arrived at essentially the same engineering principle, purely by watching what worked and what did not, generation after generation, and discarding the approaches that got their families killed. Flexibility beats brute rigidity when the force involved is large enough and sustained enough. And it turns out that lesson does not care whether the danger arrives as wind off the North Sea or as a shudder running up through solid ground on the other side of the world. None of which is to say Agnes and Watt's house was somehow indestructible, and I do not want to leave you with that impression because it would not be honest. A house built this way could absolutely fail, and plenty did all across that same coastline that very same night. Poor maintenance, a peg gone soft with rot, a section of daub nobody had gotten round to repairing. After the last bad winter, any of those weaknesses could turn a flexible, forgiving structure into a fragile one in an instant. The engineering only worked because it was maintained, watched over, patched and renewed constantly by people paying close attention, the same quiet discipline we have circled back to again and again throughout this entire story. Flexibility was the design. Diligence was what kept that design actually functioning year after year, storm after storm. That distinction matters more than it might sound like at first, because it means the survival of that one small house was never really a single decision made on a single day. It was the sum of every small, careful choice made in the years leading up to that particular night, every patch of daub properly mixed rather than rushed, every peg checked rather than ignored, every section of thatch renewed before it had a chance to weaken. The storm did not test the house. It tested every single ordinary Tuesday that came before it. So there is your answer, 6 parts in the making. Not luck, not superstition, not some accident of fate that spared one house and doomed a cathedral. A patient, hard-won understanding of how materials actually behave under violent stress, built into the walls by people who never once called what they were doing engineering, because to them it was simply how you built a house that intended to still be standing come morning. But here is the honest, slightly uncomfortable truth we have to sit with next, because I promised you this story would not oversell its own subject. Understanding the theory perfectly did not mean every single family got the execution right. Some houses built by less careful hands or maintained by families stretched too thin by hunger and labour and everything else. Medieval life demanded of them, failed anyway, sometimes quietly, sometimes catastrophically, and the reasons they failed tell us just as much about this whole way of building as the reasons Watt's house succeeded. Here is something worth sitting with, honestly, before we go any further, because I think it changes the whole shape of the story we've been telling so far. For all that clever engineering, we just spent an entire stretch unpacking the flexible joints, the breathing walls, the roof built to shrug off a gale. Most of these houses were never actually expected to last forever. And the thing that eventually brought most of them down was almost never the dramatic villain we naturally reach for. It was rarely a storm at all. It was something far slower, far quieter, and honestly a little more uncomfortable to talk about, because it looks less like bad luck and more like a mistake somebody could have caught in time. I think it is worth being upfront about why this matters too. It would be easy to end the story right where we left it a moment ago, with the triumphant image of a humble house outlasting a king's tower, and simply stop there. That would make for a satisfying ending, but it would not be an honest one. History rarely hands you a clean single lesson and then politely stops complicating itself. The same families who built houses clever enough to survive the worst storm in living memory also quite routinely lost those same houses to something as unremarkable as a delayed repair. Both things are true at once, and I think sitting with that tension tells us far more about how these people actually lived than either half of the story could on its own. Let's go back to that same deserted settlement in the Yorkshire Wolds we visited briefly earlier, Warren Percy, because the archaeology sitting quietly under that grass tells a story that complicates the triumphant note we just finished on, in a way I think is worth being honest about. Excavation after excavation at that site turned up the same pattern over and over. The walls and roofs of those peasant houses simply were not built to the kind of multi-century durability we associate with a cathedral or a castle. They wore out. And when they wore out, families did not patch around the problem forever. They rebuilt roughly once a generation, pulling down what remained and raising a fresh frame more or less on the very same spot their parents and grandparents had stood on before them. Think about what that actually means in practice across a single family's lifetime. A child born in one of these houses might grow up watching their own father dismantle the very walls they were raised inside, salvaging what timber could still be reused, discarding what had finally rotted past saving and raising a new frame on that same familiar patch of ground before that child ever reached adulthood. Home in that world was never a fixed, unchanging object passed down untouched. It was closer to a living relationship between a family and a particular plot of earth, renewed in each generation the same patient way. A coppiced hazel stool sends up fresh growth, after every cutting the site persisting, even while the actual structure standing on it was quietly replaced piece by piece, generation by generation. Now, I want to be careful with how we frame that fact, because it would be easy to hear it and conclude these houses were simply badly built, a kind of quiet failure, hiding behind everything we admired a little while ago. I do not think that is quite right, and I think the more interesting truth sits somewhere else entirely. These houses were not failing to meet some universal standard of permanence. They were succeeding at exactly the job they were actually designed for, which was never to last 500 years untouched. It was to be renewed again and again by people who understood in a way our modern habit of building and forgetting has largely lost, that a house made from living materials needed an ongoing relationship with the people living inside it, not a one-time act of construction followed by decades of neglect. But renewal only works if somebody actually does the renewing, and this is where the real mistakes start creeping in, the ones worth slowing down on properly. Water, far more than wind, was the quiet enemy of a house like this, and I think that deserves to be said plainly, because it cuts against the whole dramatic instinct of a story that opened with a howling gale. Wind makes for a better story. Water is what actually kills a timber frame slowly, patiently, usually while nobody is watching closely enough to notice until the damage is already done. Remember that ridge we talked about earlier, the section of thatch sitting right at the peak of the roof, the part that wore out fastest and needed renewing roughly once a decade. Fall behind on that single piece of maintenance even by a season or two, and rain starts finding its way past the outer layer of straw, down into the timber below, into exactly the kind of joint we spent so long admiring for its clever offset self-tightening design. And here is the uncomfortable twist in that particular story. A drawboard peg only works its magic if the wood around it stays sound. Soak that same timber in slow repeated moisture season after season, and rot sets into the fibres surrounding the peg, quietly hollowing out the very grip that made the joint so strong in the first place. The engineering had not failed at all. The wood carrying the engineering simply was not there anymore. There's a particular cruelty to that kind of failure, if I am honest, precisely because it is invisible for so long. A crack in stone announces itself. You can see it, measure it, watch it slowly widen across a season, and know exactly what is coming. Rot inside a timber joint does none of that. It hides beneath the very peg holding everything together, beneath a layer of daub that still looks perfectly sound, from the outside working away in the dark for months or years, before anyone notices so much as a slight give underfoot, or a door that no longer quite closes the way it used to. By the time the damage becomes visible, the real harm was usually done long before, quietly on some ordinary wet afternoon nobody thought was worth remembering. I want you to sit with that for a second honestly, because I think it is one of the more sobering ideas buried in this whole story. The single cleverest piece of medieval carpentry we've spent this entire evening admiring That drawboard self-tightening joint could be quietly undone not by a storm, not by poor design, but by one missed roof repair a decade earlier that nobody got around to fixing in time. It is a small, ordinary kind of failure, the sort that never makes it into a dramatic chronicle written by a monk, and I think that is exactly why it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Here is a detail from the historical record that I think adds real weight to this whole conversation, because it turns out medieval society did not simply shrug at this kind of neglect either. Land held in villenage, the kind of tenancy most families like Agnes and Watts lived under, came with a real enforceable obligation attached to it, an expectation written directly into manorial custom that a tenant would keep the house and buildings on that land in good repair. This was not simply good manners or common sense. Allow your house to fall into serious disrepair, and a lord's court could treat that neglect as a formal offence grounds in the more serious cases for reclaiming the entire holding and putting someone else on it who would actually take care of it. To help make that obligation possible to meet tenants, were often granted something called houseboat, the standing right to take a certain amount of timber from the lord's own woodland specifically for repairing their home. The lord supplied the raw material, the tenant supplied the labour and crucially the attention. Fail on either half of that arrangement and you risked losing the roof over your own family's heads, not to weather, but to a court ruling. I find that particular arrangement fascinating, honestly, because it means maintenance was never framed as a personal virtue you could simply choose to practice, or ignore the way we might treat something like tidiness today. It was closer to a formal contract, quietly enforced by the same manorial court system we talked about a little earlier, the one that recorded who owed labour, who owed rent, who held which strip of land. Keeping your roof sound was in a very real sense part of the price of staying where you were. Doesn't that reframe the whole picture a little? We have spent this entire story admiring the cleverness baked into these houses, and rightly so. But it turns out medieval society itself understood something else, just as clearly, that clever design without consistent attention was never actually enough on its own. The system only worked because neglect had real consequences attached to it socially and legally, not just structurally. Let me paint you a small, quieter scene than the ones we've used so far because I think it captures this particular lesson better than any single statistic could. Picture a different household now, not Agnes and Watt, but a family we might simply call the Fletchers, living a few villages over a few decades later. A wet autumn arrives, harvest runs long, and the ridge of their roof, the part we know wears out roughly once every 10 years, happens to fall due for renewal at exactly the worst possible moment, right as every spare hour the household has is already spoken for in the fields. They tell themselves it will hold one more season. It mostly does. A small leak starts barely noticeable, a faint darkening on one rafter that nobody quite gets around to climbing up and inspecting properly. Another wet year follows the first. By the third year, what began as a barely visible patch of damp has crept steadily down into the joint, holding that entire section of roof to the wall plate beneath it, the timber gone soft and spongy exactly where the whole structure most needed it to stay firm. It does not take a dramatic storm to finish the job at that point. An ordinary autumn gale, nothing close to the kind of event that opened this story, is more than enough to bring that one weakened corner down while the rest of the house, everywhere the family had kept up properly, stands completely unaffected around it. That, I think, is the real lesson sitting underneath all of this, and it is a more useful one than a simple story about a big dramatic storm defeating a big dramatic tower. Most structural failure in the medieval world, and honestly in our own world too, if we are willing to admit it, does not arrive suddenly out of a clear sky. It arrives slowly through 100 small postponements nobody thought was a big enough decision to bother with at the time. The house that survived our opening storm did not simply have good bones. It had an attentive family standing behind those bones, checking the ridge, patching the daub, noticing the small, dark stain on a rafter, before it ever had the chance to become a serious problem. It is worth remembering, too, that even a well-built, well-maintained house could still find itself abandoned for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with the building itself. That same site at Warren Percy did not simply fade away because individual houses wore out one by one. The whole village was eventually deserted entirely sometime in the early 1500s, following a very different kind of pressure than a leaking roof, a shrinking population in the wake of repeated plague, and a slow economic shift across that whole region toward raising sheep on open pasture rather than maintaining a full village of arable farming tenants. You could keep every single roof on every single house in perfect repair generation after generation, and still watch the entire settlement empty out around you, because the reasons a village survives or disappears were never only about how well its houses were built. Sometimes the mud held, sometimes the walls stood strong and true for 100 years, and the village emptied out anyway because the world surrounding those walls had simply changed underneath everyone's feet. It is a strange, quietly humbling thought to end on honestly. All that patient craftsmanship, all that generational knowledge about clay ratios and peg angles and roof pitches could not save a village from a change in the wool trade, or a wave of illness that left too few hands to farm the surrounding fields. Good building bought a family time comfort and a real fighting chance against the weather. It never promised permanence against everything else the world might decide to throw at a community instead. A house, in other words, was never really a story about one family and their own four walls in isolation. It sat inside something much larger, a working village full of other households, other trades, other hands, all quietly keeping the wider community alive around it, and that wider world of blacksmiths, millers, thatchers for hire, and everyone else who made a medieval village function as more than just a scattering of individual homes is exactly where we are headed next. A village, if you actually stop and think about it properly, was never just a scattering of individual houses sitting near one another out of convenience. It functioned closer to a single organism, dozens of households, each supplying one piece of something the whole community truly could not survive without, and I think we owe it to the rest of this story to spend a little time outside Watt and Agnes's front door, looking at everyone who made that survival possible around them. We've spent this whole evening understandably looking almost entirely inward at one family, one plot of land, one set of walls. But no house like this one ever stood in true isolation. It borrowed labour for its raising day from neighbours who expected the same favour returned. It borrowed timber rights from a lord's woodland. It borrowed, as we're about to see, an entire web of specialised skill from people who never touched a single peg or beam of that particular house, yet whose work made its daily survival possible all the same. Tonight's title promised you a little more than one house, and I think it is time we finally earned that promise properly. Start with a blacksmith, because his forge sat right at the centre of a small mystery we set up earlier without quite resolving it. We spent an entire evening admiring a house built without a single iron nail, held together purely by wooden pegs and clever offset joinery. So if the village blacksmith was not hammering out nails for houses, what exactly was he spending his days making? The answer tells you a lot about how carefully medieval communities rationed a seriously expensive material. Iron went toward ploughshares, toward the metal rim wrapped around a cartwheel, toward hinges, latches the head of an axe or a scythe, tools that took direct repeated abuse and needed a strength timber joinery simply could not match. A house frame, by comparison, did not need iron at all, because wood pegged to wood, as we have spent this whole story proving, could do that particular job perfectly well on its own. every blacksmith understood without anyone needing to explain it, that his limited stock of precious iron belonged wherever wood alone truly could not cope and nowhere else. Nothing in a medieval village got made from a material more valuable than the job actually required, and that discipline runs through absolutely everything we've talked about tonight. The miller occupied an even stranger, more tightly controlled corner of village life, and this is a detail I think deserves real attention, because it complicates any picture of medieval peasants as simply free people quietly grinding their own grain whenever they pleased. Across large parts of medieval England, a custom called milling soak bound every tenant on a manor to bring their grain specifically to their lord's own mill and nowhere else to be ground into flour. Owning a personal hand quern, the simple stone-grinding tool households had relied on for their own flour, since long before the Normans arrived, was in many places flatly forbidden. Get caught grinding your own corn at home instead of paying the miller's toll, and you risked losing that corn entirely, sometimes along with the very horse or cart that had carried it. The whole matter settled not by casual gossip but by a formal hearing in the Lord's own court. It sounds almost absurdly strict to modern ears, controlling something as basic as how a family turns wheat into bread, and yet it tells you something important about just how thoroughly interconnected every piece of medieval village life actually was. Bread on Wat and Agnes's table did not simply come from their own labour in their own field. It passed by law through somebody else's mill, first a mill the whole community depended on completely. Try to imagine for a moment what that actually meant on an ordinary working day. A cart loaded with sacks of grain creaking along the same muddy track that ran past every toft in the village, queuing behind neighbours doing the exact same thing, the miller weighing out his toll in grain before a single sack was even ground gossip and news trading hands as freely as flour, while everyone waited their turn. The mill was never simply a piece of machinery sitting on the edge of the village. It was one of the few places every single household in that community was guaranteed to pass through on a regular basis, which made it almost by accident one of the genuine social centres of medieval rural life, somewhere closer in spirit to a village well than to a modern factory. And you remember from right at the start of this whole story that a chronicler described watermills being torn apart that same violent night alongside houses and church towers. I mentioned it then, almost in passing, one more casualty among many. Knowing what we know now about milling soak, I think that detail lands rather differently. A destroyed mill was never simply a piece of broken machinery for one unlucky miller to worry about. It was the sole legal route an entire community had for turning a harvest into bread, gone in a single night with no quick or simple way for anyone downstream of that mill to grind their own grain in the meantime. Understanding the system helps you understand the scale of the disaster in a way the storm itself never quite explained on its own. Not every structure in a medieval village stayed modest in scale either, and I think this next example honestly surprised me the first time I properly understood it, because it takes every single technique we spent this whole evening admiring and scales it up to something almost unbelievable. Wealthy monasteries across England built enormous barns to store the crops and tithes owed to them from surrounding farmland, and some of these buildings survive more or less intact to this very day. One of them, at a village called Great Coxwell in Oxfordshire, still stands after more than 700 years, a single unbroken timber roof stretching well over 150 feet, built using the exact same aisled framing logic, the exact same pegged joinery, the exact same patient hand-hewn oak that raised Watt's far humbler home. The designer William Morris centuries later called it as noble as a cathedral, and honestly, walking underneath that roof today, It is easy to understand exactly what he meant. Think about the sheer logistics such a building actually demanded for a moment, because it puts Watts' raising day into a whole different scale of perspective. Historians studying similar great barns have found that some of the largest consumed several hundred mature oak trees in a single project, an entire generation's worth of coppice management and careful woodland stewardship. The very system we spent so long admiring earlier, called upon all at once to supply timber for one enormous unified structure. Where Watts' house drew on a season or two of careful selection from the local coppice, a barn like this drew on decades of patient forestry, planned out by people who would likely never live to see the finished roof standing over the harvest they'd spent their whole working lives helping to grow. Another surviving barn at a place called Harmondsworth turns out to be the largest timber-framed building still standing anywhere in the country, and because the monks who commissioned it kept unusually detailed financial accounts, we actually know precisely when its timbers were felled in the winters of 1424 and 1426, and precisely when its roof was finally finished in September of 1427. Every single skill we have spent this whole story admiring in one small peasant house, choosing the right curved timber, cutting a mortise and tenon by eye, pegging a joint so it tightens with age rather than loosening scales up perfectly to a building the length of a modern football pitch. It was never really two separate kinds of knowledge, humble carpentry for peasants and grand engineering for institutions. It was the same knowledge, the same hands simply working at a different size. The thatcher, meanwhile, occupied a properly specialized trade of his own, distinct enough from ordinary carpentry that it usually organized itself the way most serious medieval crafts eventually did into a guild. These thatching guilds trained apprentices properly over years rather than weeks, passing down exactly the kind of technical judgment we spent an entire earlier evening unpacking: how tightly to layer a course of straw, how deep to drive a spar when a roof had finally reached the correct pitch to shed water properly. Guilds like these also policed the quality of the work itself, protecting both the reputation of the trade and, just as importantly, the safety of the people who would end up living underneath whatever a thatcher built. A poorly built roof was never simply one family's private misfortune. It was a mark against the whole craft, and guilds took that seriously enough to actually regulate it. And that brings us to a detail I have been quietly saving until now, because it finally answers a question we left dangling several nights of storytelling ago, back when we first admired just how well a thatched roof could stand up against a genuine gale. Thatch, for all its cleverness, carries one obvious serious weakness. It burns extremely easily, and a fire that starts in one tightly packed, densely thatched roof can leap to the next roof over almost instantly, especially in a crowded medieval town where houses stood shoulder to shoulder along a narrow street. London understood this danger well, having already lived through more than one devastating fire, and in the year 1189 the city's very first mayor issued one of the earliest sets of building regulations anywhere in England, a formal code known as the Assize of Buildings. It required, among other things, that any wall shared between two neighbouring properties be built from solid stone, a minimum of 3 feet thick and 16 feet high, with the cost split evenly between both households, specifically to slow a fire's progress from one home into the next. When that first regulation failed to fully solve the problem, a second stricter fire following in the year 1212, London went even further, banning thatched roofing inside the city altogether, insisting from that point forward on tile instead. Notice too what that regulation quietly reveals about the very same stone versus timber, question we spent an entire earlier evening working through. Out in the countryside, remember, stone was the material almost nobody could afford the privilege of lords and cathedral chapters alone. Inside a crowded medieval city wealthy enough to organize formal building law, the calculation flipped entirely. Stone stopped being a luxury and became quite literally a legal requirement, because the value of preventing an entire street from burning down outweighed whatever it cost individual households to quarry and haul the material. Context did not simply decide which building method looked nicest. It decided which one the law was willing to force you to use. I find something rather satisfying in finally closing that particular loop. Out in Watt and Agnes's scattered rural village with houses spaced well apart and plenty of open field between one roof and the next, thatch remained not just acceptable, but plainly the smartest available choice. Cheap, locally grown, remarkably effective against wind and rain. Pack that same material into the tight, crowded streets of a growing medieval city, though, and the exact same technology that kept a family warm and dry in the countryside became a serious civic hazard, one deliberate lawmakers felt compelled to regulate within living memory of watching it burn. It is not that thatch was ever a flawed technology. It was once again a question of context, the very same lesson we kept circling back to when we talked about cob and half-timbering and bare-stacked stone earlier in this story. The right material was never a fixed universal answer. It depended entirely on where you happened to be standing, and how close your neighbour's roof happened to sit next to your own. Step back now and look at the whole picture together. The blacksmith rationing his precious iron, the miller controlling the only legal route from wheat to bread, the barn builders scaling up a peasant's carpentry into something worthy of a monastery, the thatching guild training the next generation by hand, the city lawmakers rewriting the rules. The moment crowded streets made an old solution dangerous. None of these people were working in isolation. Every single one of them depended on choices being made correctly, generation after generation by everyone around them, the same quiet discipline of paying close attention that built Watt's house in the first place, just multiplied out across an entire working community instead of one small toft. It is a strange kind of village when you look at it laid out this way, one held together almost entirely by unwritten rules, borrowed rights, shared obligations, and an enormous distributed amount of specialized human patience. And yet it worked well enough to feed, house and clothe millions of people across an entire medieval countryside for the better part of 1,000 years, with no cement, no factories, and no single person who understood the whole system from top to bottom. Nobody was in charge of all of it. Everybody was simply quietly responsible for their own small piece of it, trusting that their neighbours were doing the very same thing. And that brings us at last close to the end of everything we set out to understand tonight, back to one small house, standing near the edge of a village on the English coast built from bent oak, woven hazel-packed clay, and a roof of straw holding inside it a family, a fire that never quite went out, and a story that outlasted the storm which was supposed to define it. Let's stay with that image for a moment before we let it go completely. A small house near the edge of a village on the English coast, standing quietly in the dark, a fire banked low inside it, a family asleep in a loft reached by a simple ladder, walls of woven branches and clay breathing softly around them, the same way they had breathed through every storm that came before and everyone that would come after. We have spent this whole evening taking that house apart piece by patient piece, and I think it deserves a few minutes now to simply stand there again whole in your mind before we say goodnight to it properly. It is strange in a way how much time we have spent tonight with people who never actually existed exactly the way I described them. There was no single woman named Agnes standing in that doorway the morning after the storm, no single man named Watt, walking the perimeter of his own walls with his hand pressed flat against the daub. And yet I do not think that makes any of it less true. Somewhere along that coast, someone very much like her woke up to exactly that scene. Somewhere a real family whose names are simply lost to us now made every single one of the choices we have spent this evening admiring the sight, the timber, the daub, the roof, the fire kept carefully burning. We borrowed a name for them, so the story would have a shape you could hold on to in the dark, but the house itself, and the knowledge that built it, was never invented for tonight's telling. It was real, carried forward by real hands long before either of us arrived to talk about it. Here is what I keep coming back to out of everything we have covered together tonight. Not one single fact on its own, not the storm, not the drawboard pegs, not the daub, not even that lovely strange little detail about the word curfew hiding inside an ordinary bedtime ritual. What stays with me most is the pattern running underneath all of it, the same quiet instinct showing up again and again in completely different corners of this story. Watch the material. Learn what it actually wants to do. Stop fighting it and start working alongside it instead. A tree already leaning into the right curve for a roof beam. A wall that flexes rather than cracks. A roof that gives the wind nothing flat to grab hold of. None of it was ever really about mastering nature through brute force. It was about paying close enough attention to nature that force stopped being necessary in the first place. I think that is the real reason this story has stuck with me the way it has, if I am honest with you. We tend to imagine progress as something that only ever moves in one direction, forward away from mud and straw and towards steel and glass and concrete, each new material simply better than the one it replaced. And there is truth in that, plenty of it. But sit with everything we have walked through together tonight, and a slightly more complicated picture starts to come into focus. Somewhere along the way, in our rush toward permanence, toward materials that never bend and never breathe, we quietly lost hold of a few lessons the people building with nothing more than mud and bent oak had already worked out for themselves through nothing but patient trial, error, and closely watching what worked. We are only now, in a strange sort of way, finding our way back to some of it. Across England today there is a small but steadily growing movement of builders returning to exactly the material Watt's neighbours down in Devon would have recognised instantly, the same clay sand and straw mixture we spent time with earlier in this story. In the middle of the 1990s, a builder named Kevin McCabe raised the first entirely new cob house constructed in England in more than 70 years, using nothing more advanced than the same basic principles medieval hands had already perfected centuries earlier. Since then, more have followed. One cob house built in Worcestershire in the early 2000s, walls a full yard thick in places, went on to win a national award for sustainable design, praised by modern architects for precisely the same qualities we admired in Agnes and Watt's home walls that regulate their own temperature. Materials that can simply return to the earth they came from at the end of a building's life. Nothing toxic, nothing that needs to be trucked away to a landfill decades from now. I find something quietly moving in that timeline if I let myself sit with it properly. 700 years, give or take, between one family raising a house from clay and straw, because it was simply the only sensible option available to them, and another family choosing that exact same material voluntarily with every modern alternative sitting right there for the taking, because they had come to understand through very different reasoning the very same truth those earlier hands had already learned through necessity. Circumstance built the first house, conviction built the second, and yet, if you stood inside either one running your hand along a wall of the exact same clay and straw, I suspect it would be difficult to feel much distance between them at all. And it is not only cob. Look at some of the tallest new buildings going up in cities around the world right now, and you will increasingly find architects choosing engineered timber, over steel and concrete, not out of nostalgia, but because carefully joined wood turns out to store carbon rather than release it, and because, as it happens, a well-designed timber structure can flex under wind and seismic pressure in almost exactly the way we spent an entire evening admiring in a Yorkshire crook frame and a Japanese pagoda alike. The tallest wooden buildings on Earth right now are going up not in some quaint backward corner of the world, but in the most expensive, most competitive property markets on the planet, precisely because the old lesson turned out to still be true. Sometimes the newest, most sustainable answer to a building problem was actually sitting quietly in the historical record the whole time, waiting for us to take it seriously again. There is something almost funny about that in a gentle sort of way if you allow yourself to see it. For the better part of a century, tall wooden buildings were treated as a relic, something a modern city had simply outgrown, replaced by steel and glass the moment the technology allowed it. Now, some of the very same engineers who once helped push timber construction to the margins are the ones publishing papers on exactly how a well-jointed wooden frame absorbs and redirects force, essentially rediscovering with instruments and calculations conclusions a Yorkshire carpenter reached centuries earlier with nothing more than a trained eye and a very healthy respect for what had gone wrong the last time somebody got it wrong. Here is a number that puts all of this in a slightly different light, and I think it is worth sitting with before we close things out completely. By some careful estimates, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone alive on this planet right now lives or works today this very evening inside a building made substantially from earth. Not as some rare romantic exception. As an ordinary everyday reality for an enormous share of humanity, largely unnoticed by anyone living inside the concrete and steel of a wealthier city. The techniques we spent this whole story admiring in one small English village were never actually a dead, forgotten chapter of history at all. They simply moved out of the spotlight for a while in certain wealthier corners of the world, while continuing quietly everywhere else exactly the way they always had. I keep thinking too about Agnes and Watt themselves, or whoever they really were, since their true names were never written down anywhere we could ever hope to find them again. No church register recorded their birth. No manor court roll happened to preserve a stray mention of their particular toft, at least not one that has survived for us to read 8 or so centuries later. And yet, in a strange quiet way, they never really vanished either. Every single time a builder somewhere chooses to weave hazel into a wattle panel, rather than pour a foundation of concrete, every single time an architect studies the flex in a timber joint, before designing a skyscraper meant to sway safely through an earthquake, some small, unacknowledged piece of exactly what they once knew is still doing real useful work in the world. We do not remember their names. We are, whether we realize it or not, still quietly using their knowledge. I think that is worth pausing on, honestly, because it says something rather generous about how history actually works underneath all the kings and castles and famous dates we usually hang it on. Most of what keeps any of us fed, warm and sheltered was never invented by the people whose names got carved into stone. It came from millions of ordinary people just like Agnes and Wet, none of them famous, none of them recorded, each one quietly correcting the small mistake their own parents had made and passing that tiny improvement on to whoever came next. Civilization, in a lot of ways, is simply that process repeated so many billions of times over so many thousands of years that we forget it was ever a process at all and start mistaking it for something that simply always existed. That, I think, is the actual answer to the question this whole story opened with. Back when we first stood together in the dark and watched that one small house hold its ground while towers came down around it. How did people with so little manage to build something that has truly outlasted so much? Not through luck, not through some romantic, simplified idea of humble virtue, triumphing over wealth and power, because plenty of humble houses failed that same night, and plenty more crumbled slowly over the years that followed through nothing more dramatic than a missed repair. They built the way they did because they paid attention patiently, generation after generation, to a world that was always quietly telling them exactly what it needed if only somebody was willing to stop and listen. I hope wherever you happen to be tonight, on whatever screen, in whatever room, under whatever roof happens to be over your own head right now, that this story gave you something worth carrying with you into sleep. Maybe it is simply a new appreciation for a half-timbered building you walk past without a second thought. Maybe it is that small satisfying fact about the word curfew tucked away for the next time it comes up in conversation, and nobody else at the table has any idea where it actually comes from. Maybe it is just the quiet, comforting thought that people have always found a way to build safety and warmth out of whatever the world happened to hand them, storm after storm, generation after generation, long before any of us arrived and long after we are gone ourselves. Thank you honestly for spending this much time with me tonight. Stories like this one take a great deal of care to put together properly, checking every fact against real sources, trying to get the history right, rather than simply comfortable, and it means more than I can easily put into words that you chose to spend your evening curled up listening to this one all the way through to the end. If something in tonight's journey stayed with you, a detail, a feeling, a small fact you're going to bring up with somebody tomorrow, I would love to hear about it whenever you get a chance. And if you have not already, you know exactly what to do before you finally close your eyes. That small, simple gesture that helps a story like this one find its way to somebody else who might need a little bit of calm tonight too. It honestly does mean something on my end more than the usual channel talk might suggest. Putting one of these stories together takes weeks of reading, cross-checking, throwing away details that turned out not to hold up before a single word of it ever reaches you. Knowing that somebody presses play, settles in and actually stays until a small house near the Humber finally goes quiet again for the night, that is not something I take lightly, and I hope it never starts to feel that way. For now, let the fire in your own mind burn low the way Agnes and Watts did every single night, banked carefully, ready to be woken again whenever the next story calls for it. Let your own walls, whatever they happen to be made of, tonight brick, plaster, glass, concrete, do the same quiet job those clay and hazel walls did for a family. We will never truly know the names of holding the weather outside where it belongs, holding you safely on the inside, exactly the way that particular kind of wall has always patiently done its work. There are more nights like this one waiting for us, more forgotten corners of history worth wandering through together slowly, patiently, the same way every good thing in tonight's story was built. Rest well. I will see you again very soon for whatever comes next.